The wind hissed across the crumbling battlements of the abandoned fort, a lonely outpost on the edge of the far north. Snow drifted in lazy swirls around half-buried stone, the weathered gate groaning on its rusted hinges with each gust. The moon hung high, its pale light revealing jagged shards of ice along every surface. For a few moments, there was only the rasp of the wind and the skittering of loose frozen leaves whisked over stones. Then, in the distance, a faint sound echoed, like a slow, deliberate creaking. It was impossible to tell if it was just the old fort settling against the cold, or something else, something moving, a living force in this desolate place. Yet nothing living stirred here anymore, only pockets of memory and nightmares half forgotten. Beyond a twisted arch, broken pillars lay coated in sheets of frost. They looked like the bones of ancient beasts. Each pillar snapped near the base, its top portion collapsed. A wave of silver glinted in the moonlight, chunks of shattered marble, remains of a once proud building that had lost all purpose but to stand a silent witness to the creeping darkness. Somewhere behind the remnants of a collapsed tower, the sound came again. That faint, unnerving groan of something stirring. The presence that had come to claim this place was far more chilling than any winter wind. He moved without haste, each step as quiet as falling snow, his pale eyes reflecting the moon's shine in a cold, eerie glow. He wore no crown but was king nonetheless. The Night King, an ancient force bent on wiping all warmth from the realm. No living breath escaped his lips, no cloud of steam in the icy air. Wrapped around him was the power of endless night. A cold so pure it might have frozen the heart of any mortal who beheld him. Yet here he stood, among the broken shapes of old stone, seeking something beyond the worthless relics of men. His silent, implacable will reached out through the stillness, a slow ripple in the air, a summons that was at once oppressive and mesmerizing. From behind a mound of snow-caked debris, a pale hand emerged. The body it belonged to should have been reduced to little more than bones long ago. Instead, here it was, flesh rigid, under layers of hoarfrost. A man with hair so pale it caught the moonlight like molten silver lifted his head. His eyes were vacant, his face slack in death's oblivion. Viserys Targaryen had once worn pride like a mantle, an arrogance born of a name that had shaped kings and conquerors. His life had ended far to the south, in a blaze of molten gold. He should never have risen, never have walked again. But the cold of the north, harnessed by a power older than legends, does not heed the boundaries of mortality. He stood in the rubble, upright and unmoving, his skin discolored by frost's merciless claim. The shape of his face still hinted at the Targaryen features, a refined, almost delicate bone structure, eyes that had once been violet but were now stripped of color, replaced by the same glacial blue that haunted all the Night King's servants. The tattered remnants of clothing clung to him, stiff with ice and shredded in places, making him look like a puppet whose strings had been severed. But now those strings were being reattached by a force that recognized only obedience. There had been countless wights raised by the others across the decades, unthinking creatures who marched at the bidding of their master. Yet in the moment that Viserys took his first faltering step, something in the Night King's gaze flickered, a subtle ripple of deeper purpose. Often he animated the fallen in great masses, each corpse a tool. But this one felt different. Perhaps it was the faint echo of fire in the blood, a link to a lineage that had once bound dragons to mortal will. Perhaps it was merely chance. Whatever it was, the Night King's power seeped through the thin, ruined flesh of the dead Targaryen, knitting sinew and bone, kindling a spark of dreadful unlife behind those empty eyes. Viserys didn't breathe. He simply stared at the being who commanded him, his stance wavering like a fresh corpse on the verge of collapse. And then, spurred by an unseen compulsion, he shuffled forward in the snow. His footsteps left shallow prints in the white drifts, each footfall stiff and unnatural. He followed the Night King into the shadows of the fortress, vanishing from the pale light of the moon, swallowed by the darkness between broken walls. Around them, the wind continued its mournful song, as if lamenting the unveiling of this newest abomination. Far above, in the swirling night sky, clouds began to gather. It was the deep of winter, the time when the North's chill seemed an unending force. But something deeper than any earthly winter was at play. The Night King sought more than just an army. This was a creature of singular, ancient intent, guided by a purpose few living souls could understand. The dead Targaryen was but a piece on the board, albeit one that might hold a significance hidden even to his new master. A storm churned overhead, thickening the air with ice crystals, and in that hush of snow and starlight, the Night King led his newly awakened thrall deeper into realms of frost and death. In a corner of that derelict fortress, partly sheltered by collapsed stones, a cluster of wights huddled in ghastly stillness. Their ragged forms barely shifted, though one or two turned sightless heads as their king passed. The stench of old rot clung to the air, but the frozen climate spared them the full indignity of decay. There was no moan or hiss, only the blank and steady gaze of soldiers who no longer remembered their names or lives. But Viserys, in this moment, seemed oddly distinct. His pale skin and hair might have blended easily into this monstrous gathering. Yet a distant flicker, an echo of who he had been, lingered in his features. It was as if the bitterness of his life refused to surrender entirely, even in death. The Night King halted. Another stirring seemed to emanate from him, an inaudible command. Several wights separated from the pack, their motions stiff yet purposeful. They arranged themselves around Viserys, forming a small circle. He stood slack-jawed and silent, the new arrival among them, while the others measured him in their own lifeless way. Ice crackled underfoot as they moved. Then the night swallowed all once more, the hush deeper than ever. In that silence, Viserys blinked, a small mechanical gesture, but a sign of some flickering presence within the emptiness. His chest did not rise or fall. His lips did not part to speak. Yet behind those frosted lashes, a ripple of memory, or something akin to it, glimmered. Flashes of a throne he never held, illusions of grandeur, the feel of heated metal against skin, and then blinding pain. If he could recall how he died, would it evoke fear or fury? If he had any true awareness left, might he remember the sister he had once tormented and scorned? But for now, his mind remained in the thrall of the icy command. A vessel for the Night King's will. He had no purpose but to serve, and so he waited with unnatural patience, as if time meant nothing to him. The circle of wights lingered in that hushed corridor, inert as statues, until the Night King moved again. Together they ventured out into the open courtyard. The wind had dwindled, leaving behind an uncanny stillness. Moonlight flooded the wide expanse, revealing the churned snow littered with shards of wood and stone. A few broken weapons lay near a half-buried cart, testaments to an ancient skirmish that had once battered this place. The Night King proceeded across the courtyard with that ethereal grace, wights in his wake. He paused at the center, lifting his gaze to peer into the swirling sky. One by one, the dead halted behind him. Viserys stood among them, unmoving. The circle parted, allowing him to be closer to their master. If there was any vestige of his old arrogance, the same arrogance that once demanded a crown from horse lords, he did not show it. Instead, he existed in a state between stillness and forced motion, bound to the silent authority that had claimed him. For a long moment, the Night King said nothing, did nothing, only faced the sky with cold detachment. Then his head lowered, turning to meet Viserys' empty gaze. Without a word, the Night King lifted a hand. Viserys jerked like a puppet on strings, stepping forward. Another motion, as slight as a shift of a single finger, compelled Viserys to lift his arms. A faint shimmer of icy power crackled along his limbs, weaving around his torso. It seemed to outline him, tracing every contour of his once proud body. No living eye was there to see it in the same way. But to the wights and their master, this macabre energy was a tangible force. The cold aura tightened, coalescing, as if testing the boundaries of its vessel. Viserys' head lolled back, neck slack, as the power permeated him more completely. Then, as swiftly as it began, the shimmering subsided. Viserys' head tilted forward again, his distant gaze fixed on the Night King. The faintest twitch distorted his lips. It was not quite an expression, more like an involuntary spasm. But in that small movement, some echo of personality flickered, a trace of the violent temper that once consumed him. A moment later, it vanished, swallowed by the deeper cold. The Night King let his arm fall. The test was complete. Viserys stood in silence, drained of that brief spark. Far away from that ruined fortress, across a wide expanse of snowy wilderness, the sound of wolves howling punctured the night. The stark beauty of the north stretched out, an ocean of white and gray under the moon. Frozen rivers glistened under the starlight, their surfaces etched with spider-web cracks. In the distance, black trees bristled with frost-laden branches, every twig glittering like a tiny crystal in the faint glow. The air tasted sharp, each breath a sting. Though few mortal hearts dared venture this deep into the haunted north, stories were told around southern hearths of the terrifying hush that blanketed the land. It was said that where silence fell the heaviest, the others walked. Beneath the fort's ancient arches, that hush was a living thing, broken only by the shift of snow and the rasp of icy wind. Amid this gloom, the Night King's gaze fell once more upon his new thrall, as if he were examining an artifact of significance. Viserys had been a prince of the blood, heir to a name that birthed dragons. The cold, in its uncanny way, sensed the faint resonance of that lost fire. Perhaps the Night King intended to exploit it, twist it into a weapon of frost and death. Perhaps he merely gathered the once proud for his own cruel design, mocking the kingdoms of men. Whatever the reason, the ice-bound puppet that was once Viserys Targaryen would serve. The Night King's head turned toward the battered gate, a tilt that conveyed intent. Without further ceremony, he began to walk. The pack of whites formed behind him. Viserys was pulled along, steps mechanical. The wind picked up again, stirring the cloak of darkness that seemed to trail the Night King. The gates groaned as the small army moved out, leaving the carcass of the fortress behind. Soon, all that remained in that lonely ruin was the echo of their passing and the memory of once royal blood, awakened into unholy existence. They ventured across a frozen field, the moon now sinking closer to the horizon. The starlight danced on the ice, creating phantom shapes that seemed to twist and leap at the corners of vision. Viserys' half-broken boots crunched over the crusted snow. Now and again, his movements were jerky, as if every tendon in his body were stiff with rigor. The pallor of his skin seemed faintly luminescent under the moon, matching the spectral hue of his hair. In life, he had believed himself destined for greatness. The dragon, he called himself. Now in death, he was a silent foot soldier, a spirit bound by cold oblivion. They traveled for what felt like hours. The hush pressed in, broken only by occasional cracks of shifting ice, or a snarl carried on the wind. The farther they went, the denser the darkness grew. Clouds obscured the moon, and every breath of the night seemed to wrap the group in deeper shadow. The Night King led them tirelessly, never slowing, never stopping to rest. By the time pale dawn threatened the edge of the sky, they had reached a ravine. Ancient trees clung to the cliffsides, their roots tangled in the rocky soil, as if they too feared to let go. The whites and their master descended with preternatural ease, ignoring the slippery footing. Viserys slid awkwardly, half tumbling at moments, but unfeeling in his new state, he simply rose and continued when commanded. Daylight in this northern latitude was a meager, muted thing. It cast a gray pall over the land, illuminating every jagged ridge of ice, every twisted trunk of the scraggly pines. The Night King did not flinch from the weak sun. He was a creature of endless winter, unaffected by mortal cycles of day and night. His legion, likewise, knew no fatigue. They marched on until the ravine widened into a valley. At the heart of that expanse stood a black lake, its surface frozen solid, cracks fanning out like the bones of a giant spider. The sight would have been unsettling to any living traveler, an expanse of dark ice reflecting the overcast sky. Nothing stirred on its shores, no animals, no birds. The north held its breath, as though it sensed the presence of death incarnate. Upon reaching the lake, the Night King paused. He cast his piercing gaze across the expanse of ice, and the whites halted behind him. Viserys came to an abrupt stop, head lolling. In the quiet, the faint moan of wind resonated across the hollow. The Night King raised his hand once more, an imperious gesture. Some unspoken command reverberated through the dead. Dozens of them began to spread out, forming a broad perimeter around the lake's edge. Viserys remained behind the Night King, perhaps singled out for a different purpose, or perhaps kept close for reasons not even the whites could fathom. The scene became one of eerie patience. An army of corpses standing guard, their tattered remnants of clothing fluttering in the whistling gusts, as their blue eyes stared vacantly. Slowly, with deliberate precision, the Night King stepped out onto the ice. His movements were as sure as if he walked on solid ground. The cracks remained stable under his weight. He advanced toward the center of the lake, his footfalls echoing in that cavernous stillness. A jagged line in the ice shimmered beneath each step, but it did not break. Once he reached the middle, he stood motionless. A hush clung to the valley, as if the entire world awaited his next move. Viserys felt the pull of that ancient power once more, an inexorable compulsion that forced him to follow. He lurched forward, unsteady but unresisting. Halfway across, the ice groaned beneath his feet, reverberating through his dead limbs. A faint memory stirred. Was it fear? He had felt fear once, the moment a crown of molten gold sealed his fate. A mere flicker passed across his frozen features, there and gone. He pressed onward until he stood before his new master, both of them poised over the lake's frigid center. If the Night King noticed any sign of hesitation from his thrall, he gave no indication. In his gaze burned the same calm, unyielding supremacy that had endured for ages unknown. The air around them thickened with a haze of frost, drifting like phantoms around their feet. Once again, the Night King lifted his hand. This time, the gesture was smooth, as though drawing something up from the depths below. A low rumble emanated from beneath the ice. The water trapped below the frozen surface seemed to tremble. In that thunderous hush, the cracks spiderwebbed outward, yet still they did not give way. Then, from the far shore, a faint cry shattered the silence. Not human. A raven, perhaps, or some lost creature calling in the dawn gloom. The whites at the perimeter did not move. They merely kept their empty gazes trained on the horizon, waiting. Whatever the Night King attempted here, they would guard the circle. The swirl of frost around him and Viserys grew thicker, as if conjured by the same dark magic that reanimated corpses and commanded storms. It coiled around their forms, a swirling veil of ice particles so dense it was nearly opaque. Viserys was a statue in that swirling storm, arms limply at his sides, eyes on his master. The compulsion that moved him was absolute. Should the Night King direct him to walk into icy oblivion, he would do so without question. Yet in some corner of his dead being, perhaps a spark of the old Viserys stirred. A bitter protest at being bound to another's will yet again. But that spark was powerless in the face of the frigid command that now ruled him. All he could do was stand, locked in the center of the swirling vortex of snow, a revenant tethered to unimaginable cold. Time seemed to distort as the haze engulfed them. The valley might have been minutes or hours from the next gust of wind. Movement itself became a ghostly blur. The sun rose a fraction, lighting the snowy mountains in subdued gray, before sinking again behind thick clouds. The hiss of blowing ice whispered across the lake. Beneath them, the water continued to groan and settle. Each creak felt like an omen. But the Night King remained impassive. He was not mortal. He knew no doubt, no fatigue, no wavering in purpose. Eventually, the swirling frost subsided. The black surface of the ice once more came into view, marred by intricate fractures, but still intact. The only movement on that broad expanse was the fine dusting of snow drifting in the gentle breeze. A soft sigh passed through the whites at the perimeter, though not one parted its lips. It was as if they communed in silent harmony, each aware of the next through the magic that bound them. The Night King turned, leading Viserys back toward the shore. Their steps did not falter, even as they trod over precarious cracks. Once they reached the solid ground, the whites closed ranks, falling into step behind. The group resumed their march, heading eastward around the rim of the lake. Snow-laden hills rose before them, and beyond, The faint shape of distant mountains beckoned, pale silhouettes in the half-light. On and on they traveled, the day wearing thin, until the sky threatened dusk once more. They paused at intervals, whenever the Night King chose. Though his servants felt neither hunger nor exhaustion, they were bound to his will and halted when commanded, formed up again when he moved. Viserys became just another figure in that macabre troupe, except for those moments when the Night King singled him out with the faintest glance, as if testing something. In one such pause, the Night King faced Viserys. The dead man stood, arms dangling, hair slick with frost. There was no sign of recognition, only blank submission. But something flickered behind Viserys' eyes again. It was a brief, almost imperceptible glimmer, like a dying ember in a snowdrift. No breath stirred his lungs, and no warmth glowed in his cheeks. Yet for the space of a heartbeat, he seemed almost aware that he was forced to bow to a will not his own, aware that a false crown had ended his life. The flicker manifested in a subtle curl at the corners of his mouth. A movement so small it could have been a trick of the light, yet it was there. Then it died away. The emptiness returned. Darkness claimed the sky, and the wind whipped fierce once more. Snow battered their faces, as though the north had decided to rage with renewed vigor. The Night King continued, unstoppable, his tattered cloak trailing behind him. The whites trudged on, their footing sure despite the slippery ground. Viserys stumbled occasionally, but each time, a surge of unnatural strength pulled him upright. He could not die again from a fall. He could not freeze to death. The wind was powerless to bury him in drifts. He was a specter, a puppet, dragged along by the unstoppable tide of ice that guided this dreadful host. They came upon a scattering of ancient trees, tall sentinels that creaked in the wind. Needles lay in frozen clusters around the trunks, while boughs groaned under the weight of new snow. Half lost among these trunks stood a small cabin, battered by winter storms. The door hung loose, snow piled nearly to the windows. It seemed an unremarkable stop, no different from the ruins they had seen before. But the Night King stilled. The whites around him also stilled, forming a silent ring. Was there something inside this place? The door tore free with a single push from the Night King's hand. The interior was dark, the air stale. Ice coated every surface. Furniture lay overturned, any cloth rotted or stiff with frost. The remains of a fireplace stood in one corner, its stones scattered. Perhaps it had once sheltered travelers or wildlings, but not now. It was as lonely and dead as the rest of the landscape. Still, the Night King stepped inside. Viserys followed, scanning the gloom with unseeing eyes. The wind rustled through the open doorway, carrying in a flurry of snow. Without warning, the Night King drew closer to Viserys, lifting a hand toward his face. His fingertips, pale as polished bone, hovered near Viserys' forehead. For a moment, it looked almost like a gesture of discovery or examination, as though trying to probe the dormant memories that slept within this ruined body. Viserys did not flinch. He could not. The Night King's touch came at last, a chill pressure against the cold flesh. The cabin's shadows stretched like claws across the floor. In that hush, a faint tremor coursed through the dead Targaryen. Something flickered again, stronger than before. An image, half-formed, might have trembled behind Viserys' eyes. A brazen scream, the silhouette of a tall man with a wild mane of hair and a rush of scalding heat. The memory quivered, teetering on the brink of recognition. But the Night King's touch drove it back into silence, submerging it in a tide of crushing frost. No voice emerged from Viserys' lips. No spark of defiance flared in his vacant stare. Outside, the whites waited, motionless. Darkness closed around the cabin. Snow battered the roof, piling against the walls. Minutes or hours passed, it was impossible to tell. The Night King eventually withdrew his hand, stepping away from Viserys. The hush felt deeper, as though the very air held its breath. Viserys swayed, his hair trembling like silver threads in the shifting gloom. Another wave of sub-zero air rushed in from the open door, swirling around them both. The Night King, unreadable as ever, glided toward the door. Viserys followed, the compulsion weaving through his limbs. They emerged into the storm once more, rejoining the silent ranks. The day had vanished into a whirling gloom of white and black. Trees creaked and groaned. The whites fell into a formation behind their master, their eyes glinting in the faint reflection of swirling snow. The Night King turned eastward, a silent command urging them on, and so they marched. The storm enveloped them, reducing visibility to a ghostly haze. Even so, their progress did not waver. At times, the drifts rose almost waist-high. Several whites sank in, pulling themselves free with mechanical determination. Viserys too sank, his stiff limbs struggling to navigate the deepening snow. Each time he faltered, he lurched forward again, puppet-like, compelled by the unwavering presence of the Night King. That presence was like a beacon in the swirl of white, an anchor that allowed no rebellion. The valley gave way to rolling hills, each layered in thick drifts. Beyond, the shape of a mountain range loomed in the darkness, ridges like jagged teeth along the horizon. As they pressed on, something new came into view, footprints partially obscured by the blowing snow. They were fresh enough that the swirling flakes had not fully erased them. Human tracks, moving west to east, as if someone had recently crossed this lonely stretch. The Night King paused, turning his gaze upon these imprints. A faint, dangerous curiosity glimmered in that deathly stare. The whites shifted around him, heads turning to regard the footprints with the dull, lifeless recognition of hunting hounds straining for direction. Viserys too halted. For a split second, if one were watching closely, something akin to alarm might have flickered across his face, a tiny ripple in the mask of death. It was gone almost at once. The Night King knelt briefly, though no mortal words left his lips. His hand hovered over the partial track, fingertips so cold they might have frozen steel. The wind shrieked again, and one more dusting of snow threatened to bury the footprints. With a fluid motion, the Night King stood. Some soundless command traveled through the pack, and they fanned out. He did not seem to need to speak for them to know what he willed. A search, a pursuit. The presence of living flesh somewhere in this wilderness had caught his attention. They spread into a wide formation, trudging through the snow in pursuit of these faint trails. The entire host moved with eerie synchronization. Viserys found himself drawn along, drifting at the center of it all. Flurries battered his face, clinging to his lashes and hair. He felt no cold, no heat, only the unrelenting compulsion to move forward. The footprints led them farther and farther, meandering across uneven terrain. Now and again, the storm slackened, revealing glimpses of the black sky overhead. Stars gleamed in ephemeral brilliance before vanishing again behind a veil of clouds. Eventually, the tracks vanished, swallowed by the shifting drifts. The whites clustered, heads swiveling as if searching for further clues. The Night King turned slowly, surveying the wilderness with an inscrutable gaze. Then, perhaps sensing the tracks were lost, he motioned for them to continue. The footprints might be a thread to pick up later, or perhaps it mattered not. He resumed his inexorable march east, and the legion followed. Viserys, blank eyes half open, trudged at his side. Hours melted into a timeless state. The monotony of the journey, the endless fields of white, might have driven a living soul to delirium. But there was no living soul here, only the embodiment of ice-cold death and his silent slaves. Now and then, the sky lightened, a faint suggestion of dawn, only for the gloom to wrap it again. They crossed ice-choked rivers, scaled slippery embankments, always pushing onward. The wind never ceased, howling like a chorus of vengeful spirits. Frozen flakes gathered on hair and clothes, but none were deterred. After all, the dead do not tire. In the midst of this endless march, Viserys stumbled once again. This time, he fell to his knees, hands plunging into the snow. For one brief instant, the posture was eerily reminiscent of supplication, like a man who had once bowed, or perhaps been forced to kneel. A rush of wind battered him, lifting the silver strands of his hair. He should have felt nothing but a fleeting expression crossed his face, anguish, or maybe shame, some ghostly imprint of the man he had been. Could he remember bowing in desperation before his sister's Cal, words of pleas and threats tumbling from his lips? Could he remember that final moment when molten gold scorched his skull? The memory, if it still lingered, was but a tortured echo. A soft crunch behind him signaled the approach of the Night King. God. An unseen force yanked Viserys upright, compelling his body to obey. The moment passed as if it had never been. The dead Targaryen swayed, still bound to the will of his master, all ephemeral hints of old emotions once again subdued beneath the frigid compulsion. The Night King studied him for a spare instant. In that unreadable gaze, there was no sympathy, no curiosity, only the depthless will of winter. And so, Viserys marched on, arms at his sides, eyes vacant. At length, they began to climb a steep incline. The wind lessened, replaced by a suffocating stillness, as though all the air had been leached from the world. At the top of the ridge, a new vista opened before them. A vast, snow-blanketed plain, featureless save for a single rocky formation that rose in the distance like a jagged spine. The Night King paused, surveying this new terrain. His legions spread out behind him, a bleak army of silhouettes against the pale blanket of snow. Viserys remained motionless. The hush enveloping the scene was profound. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Perhaps there was something in that rocky formation that drew the Night King's interest, something old and forgotten by men. Or perhaps it was just another step in his inexorable march toward realms unsuspecting. Regardless, he moved forward, and the whites followed, the broken silhouettes of men and women, some clad in rusted armor, others in peasants' rags. Their numbers were not large, compared to the hordes once seen near the wall, but each was a tool of relentless design. Among them, Viserys marched. Night fell and rose again, though the difference in this murky northern winter was slight. Darkness or twilight, it seemed the same. Stars blinked overhead in fleeting intervals. Once, a faint green shimmer whispered across the sky, the aurora dancing in cold splendor. It illuminated the snow in faint emerald hues before vanishing into the swirling clouds. The host pressed on, drawn like moths to a silent flame that only the Night King perceived. Any living soul witnessing the procession would have known only terror. And still, in the midst of that terror, Viserys Targaryen walked, bound by ice. Each step was a sacrilege to the fiery heritage of House Targaryen. Each ragged breath he did not take mocked the living vitality once carried in that name. The snow and ice that clung to him bore witness to the transformation of a royal lineage into a ghastly puppet. If any gods existed, they offered no salvation, no final rest. This was the dominion of the Great Other, the ancient darkness beyond the wall, and nothing mortal could stand in the face of it. Perhaps the cold skies were pleased by this turn, or perhaps they were indifferent. The storm slackened, granting a fleeting moment of clarity. In the quiet that settled, one might almost imagine hearing the beating of distant wings, something akin to thunder, or the rush of air beneath colossal pinions. But no dragon soared overhead, no creature of living fire came to challenge the chill. The only shapes in the gloom were the ragged, unholy silhouettes of an army that never tired. Onward they went, drifting through drifts, ascending and descending ridges in a slow, steady progression. Occasionally the Night King would pause, head tilted as if listening. Sometimes he sent a portion of whites to scout a path around a ravine. Sometimes he merely waited, as though scrying the flow of time itself. Viserys always remained close, singled out by that invisible tether, an undying icon of a once proud house. At long last, they reached the base of the rocky formation. Jagged boulders jutted upward, dusted with a fine powder of snow. Icicles hung in bizarre shapes, some of them as long as a man's arm. A natural archway led into a shallow cavern, its interior hidden in darkness. The Night King did not hesitate, stepping into the shadows with the regal bearing of a conqueror claiming new territory. The whites filed in behind him, forming a loose semicircle in the cavern's space. Viserys entered, a swirl of snow trailing from his boots. Inside, the air was surprisingly still. Ice clung to the walls, forming crystalline patterns, that caught the faint light drifting in from outside. The space was neither large nor small. It felt like some primordial hollow carved by centuries of wind and water. A subtle dripping noise echoed, droplets of meltwater striking stone. The hush thickened. The Night King moved deeper, exploring the confines. At the far end, a curtain of dangling icicles sealed off a narrow passage. He raised a hand, and a faint crackling filled the air. The icicles shattered, falling to the ground in a spray of crystal fragments. What lay beyond was a deeper chamber. The gloom was absolute until the Night King entered, his eyes casting a cold luminescence that illuminated pillars of ice, like macabre pillars in a frozen cathedral. Stalactites dripped from the ceiling, some meeting stalagmites to form thick columns. The atmosphere was that of an ancient tomb, a place untouched for uncounted ages. The whites gathered at the edges, forming a hushed audience. Viserys stood near the center, facing his master's back, the breathless hush smothering any sense of time. Then the Night King turned to him again, those pale, intense eyes fixed on the once dragon prince, and an inexorable force prickled through the air. Viserys stiffened as that force coursed through him, coiling around every nerve. If there was any part of him capable of fear or rage, it was drowned in a suffocating wave of ice. Slowly, mechanically, he raised his arms, compelled to offer them to his master. The Night King lowered his gaze to Viserys' hands, the cracked skin, the brittle nails. Faint, inhuman curiosity glimmered in the king's expression, as though measuring how far this Targaryen's body might be pushed before it shattered entirely. A final surge of power blossomed, swirling like a miniature storm around their feet. The shadows around them seemed to darken, as though even the faint light from outside was banished. The whites stood as silent witnesses, lifeless eyes reflecting their king's power. And in that moment, the hush grew profound, a silence so absolute that it echoed in the mind. Ice crystals danced in the air, catching the hint of that pale glow from the Night King's eyes. Viserys' hair rose in a shimmering veil, animated by the electric tension of magic. The final vestiges of any identity in him, if such existed, faced obliteration beneath this onslaught of frost. The Night King exhaled silently, no visible breath, only a shift in the atmosphere. His hand hovered once more near Viserys' face, the gesture identical to what had happened in the cabin. With that contact, the hush broke in a thunderous mental roar. Though the physical air remained still, Viserys felt something surge behind his eyes, a painful torrent of memories or illusions. Flashes of fire, the echo of a woman's scream, the tang of betrayal, a throne of swords glimmering in dim torchlight. Then it was all consumed by white emptiness. A final wave crashed through him, and the swirling magic flared with cold brilliance. When the light faded, Viserys collapsed to one knee, supported only by the invisible leash tethering him to his master. His expression remained lifeless, but there was a new weight in that emptiness, as though he had been pressed deeper into the cold, hammered into shape by the Night King's design. If a will had once existed, even in flickering form, it had been annihilated, replaced by a frigid hush that devoured everything in its path. The faint illusions of the past shattered against the implacable tyranny of endless winter. The Night King regarded him like a craftsman inspecting a completed work. Slowly he lowered his hand, and the swirl of frost ebbed. The cavern fell silent, its gloom only slightly lifted by the ghostly glow of glacial reflections. One by one the whites shifted, as though awed by the display of power. Viserys did not move. He knelt, head lowered, eyes wide open yet unseeing, a testament to the final victory of ice over any lingering spark of mortal identity. If the House of the Dragon had any meaning left in him, it was now enslaved by a power older and colder than any mortal dream. At length, the Night King turned away, moving deeper into the cavern, seeking who knew what mysteries within. The whites followed, leaving Viserys kneeling at the threshold like a silent sentinel. The hush returned, broken only by the soft dripping of water from the icy formations. No breath stirred Viserys' chest, no heartbeat thundered in his veins. He was death incarnate, bound by unholy magic, a marionette dancing on the stage of the long night. Snow continued to fall outside, a relentless cascade. The swirling wind whistled through the jagged archway, echoing in the hollow like the forlorn cry of ghosts. Somewhere far beyond, in lands untouched by this creeping darkness, men still lit fires and told tales to chase away the cold. But here, deep in the north, the dead had their own tales to tell, and their stage was this frozen domain of endless night. Viserys Targaryen, once a man consumed by hunger for a crown, had found a different sort of immortality. No gold crowned his head. No searing pain accompanied his final breath. Now, he wore only the frost, the silence, and the vacant gaze of a soul enslaved. Time slipped by, unmeasured. The whites milled through the cavern's passageways, some returning to stand vigil. The Night King's purpose was inscrutable, yet every motion he made spoke of an intent that stretched beyond mortal reckoning. In that time, Viserys remained where he was placed, a creature of absolute obedience. Outside, the storm threatened to rise again, the wind howling in savage crescendos. Inside, the hush was complete, a realm of ice locked within rock. If there was any warmth left in the world, any hope of rescue or redemption, it was infinitely distant, beyond the swirling snow and the pale horizon. High above, the sky grew darker, the sun lost behind rolling banks of gray. It might have been dawn, afternoon, or dusk. Here, such distinctions blurred. All that mattered was the creeping cold, and the power that commanded it. And so, he knelt, and so the Night King moved beyond mortal sight, weaving the next strand of his plan. If Viserys Targaryen had once dreamed of ascending to the heights of kingship, he had, in a terrible way, become linked to a king beyond mortal comprehension. Yet none would envy him this fate. His life had been driven by fear and greed. His second existence was subjugated by an icebound malice that recognized no sovereignty but its own. That hush persisted, as though it too had become sentient, pressing down on everything like a living weight. Each drifting mote of snow seemed suspended in the still air. The hush was absolute. The hush was eternal. And in that hush, Viserys Targaryen was a monument to a cold so deep it devoured history and future alike, leaving only the silent, frozen present. The hush felt alive, a palpable weight pressing upon the icebound cavern. Viserys Targaryen knelt where the Night King's final command had left him. Head inclined, eyes vacant in that half-seeing stare of the undead. No breath stirred his chest, no tremor disturbed his limbs. He was more statue than man, the last spark of humanity smothered by the cold. In the distance, beyond frosted pillars and jagged ridges of ice, came the faint rustle of the Night King's whites gathering in the deeper chambers. Their slow shuffle across the stone had a deadened echo, like bones dragging over silent ground. Occasionally, the crash of falling icicles shattered the air, and then the hush would return, deeper than before. The drip of melting ice resonated behind him, water sliding along slick stone until the droplets clattered onto the floor. Each echoing drop seemed to punctuate the emptiness within him. If any glimmer of recollection pulsed behind Viserys' lifeless eyes, it had no power to shape his face. He knelt motionless, arms limp at his sides. Even the drift of his hair had subsided, silver strands plastered to his brow by the faint moisture in the cavern. Outside, the wind intensified, howling through the rocky crevices like a torment of lost souls. A swirl of snow drifted past the cavern's mouth, scattering across the threshold in ghostly spirals. After some timeless interval, a silent ripple traveled through the darkness, a pulse that only the dead seemed to sense. Viserys twitched, compelled to move by that voiceless summons. His knees creaked as he rose, a stiff, unnatural motion. Dusting of powdery snow flaked from his garments, drifting to the ground. In the gloom beyond, a shape advanced, pale eyes glowing like distant stars. The Night King emerged from the deeper recesses of the cave, stepping with that inhuman grace that belonged to no mortal being. Behind him, shadows flickered with the movement of whites, their blank faces pivoting toward Viserys. He did not speak. He never spoke. But the silent gesture of his hand was a command. Viserys, newly upright, took a stumbling step forward. His arms wavered, then fell back to his sides, and he moved closer to the Night King with the halting tread of a marionette. The darkness between them crackled with a faint undertone of power. Viserys' dead eyes, filmed with frost, tried to focus on the being that held his leash. Memories might have stirred if he had any left, some echo of defiance or fury. Instead, only the hush. The hush was all-encompassing, deeper than the blackness of the cave. There, in the flickering gloom, the Night King raised a hand to the level of Viserys' chest, just a breath away from touching his tunic. That single motion halted Viserys mid-step, pinning him to the spot as though invisible chains bound his ankles. A faint sheen of frost spread along the dead Targaryen's collar, glinting with eerie luminescence. The Night King's eyes glowed more intensely, twin shards of unnatural light. Silence pulsed around them, as if even the dripping water had gone still to watch. Viserys felt an inward tug, a command upon his very essence. Though he no longer possessed a beating heart or living blood, some echo of old vitality remained, woven into the fabric of his body. It was that echo the Night King sought, testing the boundaries of the ice that possessed Viserys. A surge rippled through him, a rime of frost forming along his jawline, creeping up to his temples. His lips parted in a silent rasp, but no sound escaped. For one agonizing moment, his eyes flared wide, and it seemed as though a faint swirl of color, once the regal violet of House Targaryen, flickered in the sea of glacial blue. Then it was gone, devoured by the frigid glow that tethered him to death. Slowly, the Night King lowered his hand. Viserys felt the compulsion relent. His posture sagged by a fraction, as though an enormous weight had just been lifted from him, only to be replaced by the heavier burden of obedience. The hush returned, unbroken. The only evidence of that momentary clash was the shimmering frost that rimed Viserys' cheekbones. The Night King turned away, leading him deeper into the cavern, and he followed without resistance. The cavern twisted and spiraled, each corridor dotted with ancient icicles that hung like malevolent fangs. Glacial formations gleamed in half-light, shimmering with a watery luminescence. The Whites had arranged themselves along the walls, standing still as a row of pale mannequins. Their eyes tracked Viserys, a silent communal observation, but they made no move to intercept him. He passed between them, each step guided by the subtle beckoning of the Night King. The hush weighed like a cloak, and the deeper they went, the colder it grew. Each breathless moment seemed to intensify the stasis of this place, a tomb outside the flow of time. They emerged at last into a broader chamber. The ceiling arched overhead in a vault of ice, shot through with veins of black stone. Pillars formed from the merging of stalactites and stalagmites framed the perimeter, their surfaces glimmering in the faint reflection of the Night King's icy aura. The Whites filed in behind, some kneeling, some standing, but all showing a kind of dreadful reverence for the presence in their midst. Viserys stood near the center, waiting. The hush enveloped them like a living thing. Into that hush came a resonant crack. The Night King's pale gaze flicked to the far edge of the chamber, where a ragged figure in decaying leathers sprawled across the icy floor. Another White, newly risen, twitched uncontrollably. Perhaps this one had been retrieved from somewhere beyond these mountains. Perhaps it had only just answered the Night King's silent summons. In the gloom, it rose to its knees with jerky movements, head lolling. Frost clung to its face, blank eyes reflecting the same azure glow. The Night King watched impassively. The entire cave seemed to tremble with his command, binding the newcomer to his endless legion. Viserys' gaze settled upon this new arrival. Once, he might have felt revulsion or pity, but now, nothing stirred behind his eyes. The hush remained. The other White stumbled forward a few paces, then halted, as though sensing the intangible thread that linked it to the Master of Cold. A slight tilt of the Night King's head, and the White fell into place among its silent kin. That was all. A life that had been ended somewhere in these remote wilds now had a second fate, as meaningless and mechanical as any of the countless others. With that done, the Night King turned again to Viserys. Their eyes locked. Lifeless blue meeting. Lifeless blue. But something in the Night King's stillness suggested deeper calculation. Whatever remained of the Targaryen was an anomaly. A once prince with a sliver of fire in his blood, even in death. An instrument to be honed, perhaps. Slowly, the Master of Frost lifted one hand, and an icy current of wind began to swirl through the chamber, sending ribbons of blowing snow twisting around the pillars. It gathered around Viserys' feet, drifting upward in a spiral. Ice crystals bounced off his legs, dancing in the ephemeral vortex. A subtle shift in that swirl made Viserys lift an arm, elbow bent, as though shielding himself from the whirling snow. Of course, he felt neither cold nor pain, yet the movement seemed reflexive. A ghost from the man he once was. The Night King stood unmoving, conjuring the surge of wind with only his silent command. The swirl intensified, wrapping Viserys in a howling gust. His hair whipped around his features, and frost clung to his eyelashes. Beneath his tunic, the dead flesh stiffened. He remained a rigid figure at the center of a gathering storm. At the perimeter, the whites observed without expression, their postures as still as statues. Perhaps within each reanimated husk, some distant memory flickered, a recollection of wind or storm. If so, it had no effect on them now. They existed only to serve the power that chained them. Viserys existed for the same reason, yet there was something more, some intangible curiosity that compelled the Night King to test him. Could he wield this broken Targaryen as a conduit? Could a fragment of the old magic that once danced in Targaryen veins be twisted to serve the dark? The hush vibrated with the intensity of that question, as if the walls themselves awaited the outcome. A sudden violent flash of pale light burst around Viserys, hallowing him in a swirl of frost. The wind roared, rising to a shrieking pitch that rivaled the storms outside. For a heartbeat, Viserys' eyes rolled back, and his arms flung wide, as though a torrent of power flowed through him. The whites recoiled, half a step backward, as the swirl spilled outward in a wave that rattled the icicles overhead. The Night King stood firm, his ragged cloak snapping behind him in the gale. Then, as swiftly as it rose, the vortex died. Snow settled in silent waves, drifting to the cavern floor like so many spent moths. The hush returned, deeper than ever, pressing upon every surface. Viserys stood slumped, eyes vacant, arms slowly lowering. The faint halo of frost around him dimmed, receding back into the gloom. If there had been any test, it was inconclusive. Nothing dramatic happened beyond that surge of cold. No dragonfire manifested in him, no spark of living magic. The hush offered no triumph or disappointment. The Night King's face remained a blank, impenetrable mask. Slow footfalls approached. A handful of whites, propelled by a nudge of silent will. They surrounded Viserys, forming a ring. He did not move. His posture slack. One of them reached out with a stiff hand, brushing dusted ice from his shoulder. Another lifted a ragged scrap of cloth from the ground, the remains of some old garment, and draped it over Viserys' arms, though the gesture was meaningless for warmth. The hush swallowed the act. When they finished, they retreated, leaving him standing alone in the center once more. High above, a low rumble hinted at thunder. Perhaps it was merely the mountain shifting, or a distant avalanche echoing through the labyrinth of stone. The Night King raised his gaze, as though listening. Then, with a slow pivot, he turned to lead the entire assembly from the chamber. Viserys followed at once, footsteps tracing the path. The hush, so constant, was more than a lack of sound. It was a presence, a thing as alive as the cold that sustained them, a testament to the unstoppable march of winter. They traversed a winding corridor, columns of ice on each side. The walls shimmered with a faint luminescence, refracting each movement in ghostly echoes. Every step resounded softly, muffled by layers of permafrost. Here and there, smaller passages branched off into darkness, but the whites did not stray. Their master's course was fixed. Eventually, a pale glow marked the threshold to the outside world. Through the opening in the rock, the swirl of wind carried new flakes of snow. Night blanketed the land, the black sky swirling with ragged clouds that hid the stars. One by one, the dead emerged from the cave, footsteps crunching on fresh drifts. Outside, the wind tore at them with renewed ferocity. The Night King stood at the front of the host, scanning the horizon. Jagged ridges of rock and ice stretched in every direction, distant silhouettes like broken teeth. It was impossible to tell which direction was truly south, or north, or east. The landscape had lost all sense of boundary, consumed by winter's expanse. Yet he knew the path. With the faintest tilt of his body, he guided his legion down a slope of piled snow, deeper into the wilderness. Viserys descended after him, half stumbling, half sliding, guided more by compulsion than skill. The hush of the cavern transformed into the wail of the storm, yet in his mind, it remained hush. No thought or feeling intruded. The wind whipped at his hair, flinging snow into his eyes, but he did not blink. The dead do not need the comfort of reflex. Behind him, the whites moved in a silent wave, each step in eerie unison. They pressed onward across the frozen plains, the storm beating at them without mercy. An endless night hung overhead, the clouds so thick that the moon offered no guidance. Now and again, a wicked gust would tear at the group, scouring layers of frost from their garments, but they never faltered. The Night King led them with that implacable stride, forging across ice-slick ravines, skirting the edges of frozen lakes, climbing slopes of dense snow. Sometimes he paused, head swiveling as if listening to the wind, then continued. Time itself lost meaning in that swirling dark. For the living, it would have been a journey of terror and exhaustion. But here, the hush was all. Somewhere in the bleak distance, the sky began to lighten. Gray dawn replaced black night, illuminating the rolling drifts in a cold silver glow. Sharp shadows drew themselves across the ridges, and the wind's howl seemed ever present. The legion pressed onward, until at last they stood upon the cusp of a deep canyon. A jagged crack in the earth yawned before them, its depths lost in swirling clouds of spindrift snow. Ice encrusted the canyon walls, forming a treacherous descent. The Night King paused, measuring the distance, then turned his face north, following the canyon's rim. Viserys and the whites fell in line, trudging across a narrow shelf along the edge. With each step, chunks of ice broke free, tumbling into the void. A muffled crash occasionally echoed from below, but no trace of fear stirred among the ranks of the dead. Viserys followed as unhesitatingly as the rest, forced along by invisible shackles. The hush lived in him, a vacuum that devoured all possibility of thought or doubt. The path twisted in a slow arc, eventually leading them to a natural stone bridge spanning the canyon. It was slick with ice, narrow and precarious. The wind shrieked across its length, threatening to tear away anything that tried to cross. The Night King stepped onto it first, that silent confidence never wavering. One by one, the whites followed, until Viserys found himself nearing the center. Halfway across, a gust of wind ripped through them, strong enough to send one white tumbling off the edge. It fell without a sound, plummeting into the swirling depths. Viserys felt the sudden jerk of tension in the group, as if a thread had snapped. Yet no living cry rang out. No voice lamented the lost soldier. The hush endured. They marched on, reaching the opposite side without further incident. The Night King did not glance back. His will remained fixed on the horizon. The canyon behind them. The legion continued across a field of broken ice. Ridges jutted like shards of glass, and frozen cracks glistened in the dawn. In the far distance, a cluster of dead pines stood, their silhouettes black against the pale sky. As they neared, the shapes became clearer. A small stand of stunted trees, skeletal branches encrusted with hoarfrost. Beneath them lay the crumbling remains of a wooden structure, perhaps once a storage shed for travelers. Now its little more than half-rotted beams jutting from the snow. Without warning, the wind carried a faint noise, too distant to identify clearly, but it had the murmur of human voices, or perhaps the whisper of animals. The Night King stopped, raising his head with the slow deliberation of a predator catching a scent. An electric chill rippled through the hush, traveling from him to the whites. Viserys felt it like a subtle tug at the core of his being. A directive to remain absolutely still. They waited, letting the wind shift again, listening. Another faint noise drifted across the ice, sounding like a muffled clank. Somewhere beyond the copse of dead pines, life stirred. Perhaps a handful of scavengers or wildlings, driven to these desolate regions by desperation. Perhaps something else. The whites did not stir on their own, only stared into the distance with blank intent. The hush thickened, waiting for the Night King's will to shape it. After several moments, he took a single step forward, guiding the host to follow. They fanned out slightly, crossing the remains of the structure, boots crunching on rotted wood. On the other side of the pines, the land sloped downward into a shallow hollow. Snowdrifts cascaded into the depression, partially obscuring rocky outcroppings. At the base of one outcrop, a faint glow flickered. Firelight, perhaps, seeping from a makeshift camp. Figures moved around it, too far away to see clearly, but their forms were upright, living. The hush in the legion's midst became a poised readiness, a silent anticipation of the Night King's command. He did not lunge forward, nor did he hurry. Instead, he stepped carefully, placing each foot with grace, as though measuring the distance. The whites advanced in eerie unison, closing the gap. Viserys went with them, his face devoid of any trace of mortal emotion. Once, he might have felt savage glee at cornering prey, or delirious fear if the roles were reversed. But that man was gone. The hush was everything. Closer now. The shapes materialized into three figures huddled around a small fire. Their clothes were ragged, patched furs that had seen better days, and their faces drawn with fatigue. One was a woman with a hood pulled low over her brow. The second was a gaunt man leaning on a makeshift spear. The third, a younger lad barely in his teens, shivering despite the fire. They had not noticed the silent approach of death along the slopes behind them. The crackle of their fire and the howl of the wind masked all sound. The whites spread out, forming a crescent that would enclose the hollow. The woman turned slightly, as if she sensed something on the periphery of her vision. Her eyes widened. She grabbed the boy's shoulder, yanking him close. The man lurched upright, spear in hand, eyes darting to the ring of white-faced figures emerging from the gloom. Panic flared across his face. He shouted a warning, voice lost in the wind. The hush from the legion answered with total silence. The young boy fumbled for an axe, nearly dropping it in the snow. The woman clutched his arm to steady him, her face contorted in terror. She looked up at the shapes advancing, forms in tattered garb, eyes burning with cold light, each step purposeful. The man with the spear brandished it helplessly, scanning the ranks for any sign of a weakness or mercy. Then he saw the shape at the center, a tall, regal figure with skin like living ice and eyes of ancient wrath. The spear point wavered. The man took an involuntary step back. The Night King raised an arm. The hush transformed into a command that vibrated through each undead vessel. They surged forward without a sound. The man shouted, thrusting with his spear, but the first white brushed aside the weapon with unnatural strength, wrenching it from his grasp. The boy swung his axe in desperate terror, managing to strike a shallow blow into another white's shoulder. No blood spilled, only a spatter of frozen flesh and the crunch of bone. The white staggered but did not fall. Viserys hung back at first, compelled to watch. His expression remained blank, though some distant echo might have stirred in him, a memory of violence perhaps, or the way he had once brandished empty threats. But the hush allowed no room for personal recollection. When the wave of whites parted, giving him a path, he stepped forward. The boy, eyes wide with horror, raised the axe again. Viserys did not flinch. He reached out with a stiff motion, seizing the axe handle mid-swing. Even in his undead state, he retained enough reflex to twist it free from trembling hands. The boy stumbled, hitting the ground with a cry. The woman rushed to protect him, brandishing a crude dagger. She lunged, and the tip scraped across Viserys' chest, leaving a shallow gouge in the frozen flesh. No reaction flickered in his eyes. She tried to stab again, but he caught her wrist, mechanical and unyielding. The hush extended from him to her, an inevitable doom. Her eyes filled with tears that froze along her lashes. He forced the dagger from her grip. In life, he had never been a skilled warrior, but death had erased such distinctions. He was an extension of the Night King's power, a puppet with enough strength to overpower the living. Behind them, the gaunt man swung his fists at another white, only to be overwhelmed, pinned against the snow. A silent scuffle ensued as the legion closed in. The wind roared overhead, drowning out any pleas. For a moment, the boy tried to scramble to his feet, but Viserys' grip found him. Then it was done. The hush swallowed the last cry, leaving 3 lifeless bodies in the snow. The whites dragged them away from the embers of the dying fire, away from the meager scrap of warmth. The hush reigned, and soon, under the ancient power that raised all the fallen, those 3 bodies would stand again. But the Night King did not linger to watch the reanimation. He was already moving on, surveying the horizon as though searching for the next fragment of living energy to devour. Viserys followed, leaving the whites to their gruesome task. The air stank of fresh death, a coppery tang that almost broke through the numbness. But it too was subsumed by the hush, lost in the swirl of snow. Viserys felt not the slightest flicker of remorse or triumph. He was no more than an empty shell. The storm raged on, driving the Night King and his legion to seek a path around the rising drifts. Ice crystals battered their forms, but none slowed. Sometime later, the newly risen trio joined them, each with vacant eyes and mechanical steps. They fell into line without recognition, as if they had never been anything but whites. The hush enveloped them, binding them to the unstoppable progression of the undead host. Viserys paid them no attention, nor did any sign of memory spark when he glanced over their pale faces. They were simply more fodder for the night. Onward they marched, hours blending into an endless repetition of white and shadow. The wind's roar became a lullaby to the dead, each gust shaping the hush into a primal drone. Now and again, the Night King would pause at a vantage point, scanning the horizon. Once, he halted to lift an arm, as though tasting something intangible in the air. A faint shimmer of eerie light rippled overhead, the aurora dancing in silent green ribbons. He regarded it for a moment, then resumed his journey, leading the legion up a ridge. At the top, they overlooked a broad valley. Frozen streams etched lines across the plains, and the bare limbs of distant forests marked a transition into gentler terrain. The wind lulled, allowing a profound silence to settle. Snow fell in soft, weightless flakes. The hush thickened again, a stifling presence that seemed to hold the entire valley under its dominion. Viserys stood at the Night King's flank, hair limned with frost, eyes vacant. Beyond them, the ranks of whites formed a ragged silhouette. Through that hush came a soft sound, the distant echoes of large wings slicing through the air. High above, a shape wheeled across the skies, too far to discern. It might have been a bird of prey or a stray raven, impossibly lost in this vast northern wilderness. The Night King's gaze tracked it with cool detachment, as though measuring whether it held any threat or use. In the end, the winged creature vanished into the clouds, leaving no more than a fleeting memory of motion. The hush remained. They descended the ridge, the slope gentle, snow crunching underfoot in deep drifts. The valley opened before them, revealing a patchwork of icy ponds and black rock. Here, the Night King paused yet again, something about the terrain catching his eye. A jagged outcrop jutted above the snow, forming a natural enclosure on one side. Perhaps he sensed another lingering echo of life. Perhaps he merely needed to pass this way. He led the legion toward it, unhurried. As they drew near, the hush broke with a low animal hiss. Nestled behind the outcrop, a pair of gaunt wolves stood over the carcass of a deer. Fresh kill. Their fur was ragged, clinging to skeletal frames. They bristled at the sight of the undead throng, hackles raised, teeth bared in snarling defiance. A single step from the Night King sent them retreating apace, but starvation had made them bold. They hunkered over their prey, determined not to yield the morsel. The whites approached in silent unison. One wolf lunged, snapping its jaws at the nearest corpse. It tore a piece of frozen flesh from the white's forearm, but found no satisfaction, only the taste of death. The white did not react. Another jerk of movement from the legion forced the wolves to backpedal. Still, they growled, eyes wild with hunger. The hush enveloped them, unnatural silence pressing on the edges of their instincts. For a moment, it seemed they might fight. Then the bigger wolf, muzzle coated in congealed blood, let out a final snarl before turning and slinking away, tail low. The second followed, leaving the deer's carcass behind. The dead paid no heed to the wolves' retreat. They had no need of the kill. They moved on, stepping over the half-eaten corpse in their path, continuing toward the outcrop. Viserys, trailing near the front, caught a faint whiff of decay, but it stirred no reaction in him. The hush was all that governed him. The biting wind, the stench of blood, the swirling frost, none of it registered as more than a shapeless backdrop. Beyond the outcrop, the land sloped downward again, leading them deeper into a series of undulating hills. In the gathering twilight, the snow took on a soft lavender hue, as though dusk had draped the valley in silent lament. The whites trudged on without rest. Viserys' limbs moved in an endless cycle of numb extension and retraction. Perhaps in the past, he would have collapsed from fatigue, or let bitterness poison his mind with each painful mile. Now the hush kept him empty, a walking instrument of cold. It might have been hours or days before a new landmark came into sight. A solitary tower rising from the crest of a low hill. The tower looked ancient, built of weathered stone, its top partially collapsed. Snow dusted its ledges. A faint path meandered from its base, but any sign of footprints or wheel ruts had long since vanished. The structure stood against the twilight sky like a silent sentinel. The Night King steered them toward it, though whether from curiosity or some deeper knowledge, none could say. Upon reaching the tower, they found the remnants of a wall encircling it, half buried in drifts. Broken stones littered the ground. The gate, once iron-bound wood, lay shattered into rotting fragments. The whites passed through the gap with methodical steps. The courtyard within was small, dominated by a deep well and strewn debris. The tower door stood ajar, and the interior beckoned with darkness. One after another, whites vanished inside, the hush swallowing even the sound of their feet on the stone floor. Viserys was among the last to enter. Inside, the air hung stale and frigid. A spiral staircase wound up the tower's interior, though part of it had collapsed. Tattered banners, unrecognizable from centuries of decay, clung to the walls. The hush pressed in more strongly than ever. It felt as though this tower had stood for ages, waiting for an unholy presence to claim it. The whites spread through the lower chambers in quiet exploration, opening doors that led to storerooms or small adjoining rooms. All were empty, except for broken furniture and shards of pottery. The Night King moved through the gloom, ascending partway up the spiral steps until they ended in a jagged break. He peered upward at the crumbling stones overhead. Then he turned, drifting back down. It was a pointless ruin, offering little of strategic value, but it would serve as shelter from the worst of the storm. He stood in what must once have been a hall of sorts, a half-collapsed ceiling overhead. Pale light slanted in through a crack high in the wall. One by one, the whites filed in, forming a silent assembly around him. Viserys was among them, hands hanging limply. The hush settled like dust, blanketing the old stones. Time passed in that broken hall. The wind whistled through the cracks, but the structure offered enough respite that the interior stayed relatively still. Drifts of snow formed in corners, swirling whenever a gust found its way inside. The whites stood or crouched, some motionless as statues, others tilting their heads as though listening to echoes of the past. Viserys remained near the Night King, awaiting the next command that might stir him to motion. Eventually, the sky outside faded to complete darkness. A few patches of cloud parted, revealing faint stars beyond. The hush inside the tower felt timeless, as though the building itself had become part of the undead realm. The Night King gazed upward, where a gap in the ceiling revealed a narrow slice of sky. Without a word, he reached out, pressing his palm against a fallen slab of stone. A web of frost spread from his touch, creeping over the stone and radiating outward. It climbed the walls, forging intricate patterns. The hush deepened, each breath of wind outside seeming more distant. Viserys felt a faint shudder run through his legs, as though the magic at play tested the bounds of his own reanimation. The shimmering frost crawled along the walls, meeting overhead in the damaged portion of the ceiling. Within moments, a new layer of ice formed, sealing the gap against the night's wind. Snow dusted it from above, but it held firm. Now the old hall was enclosed, a tomb of stone and ice. Only the swirl of faint light along the edges hinted at the world outside. The Whites watched in silence. Whatever power the Night King unleashed to reshape this ruin into an extension of his own domain, they accepted it without reaction. Viserys stood as though transfixed, eyes fixed on the swirling frost. The hush hovered like a living force, pressing in on every side. No living warmth remained in that chamber, only the breathless quiet of unending winter. If any mortal had stumbled upon them, the scene would have resembled a ritual of the dead, a ghostly congregation beneath a new-formed dome of ice. Bit by bit, the wind's roar faded beyond the walls, muffled by thick layers of stone and frost. The hush was nearly absolute, yet there was a subtle shift in the air, a sense that time drifted in slow eddies, unmarked by the usual rhythms of day and night. In that moment, the Night King turned his attention to Viserys. The dead Targaryen's pale hair lay plastered against his scalp, stiff with ice. His once fine features were drawn taut, frozen into a perpetual blankness. The Night King gestured, and Viserys stepped forward, coming closer until there was barely a foot of space between them. A swirl of invisible energy brushed through the hush, vibrating along the edges of perception. Viserys lifted his gaze to meet the ancient king's stare. Frost crusted the corners of his mouth. When he parted his lips, only silence emerged, as though any vestige of speech had been stripped from him. The hush devoured language, leaving only the brittle presence of cold. Still, the Night King studied him, reminiscent of a craftsman appraising a half-finished piece. There was something about Viserys, some remnant of a bond of fire that might be twisted or subjugated by ice. If the Night King sensed it, he gave no outward sign, only the subtle tilt of his head as his frigid stare bored deeper. Viserys stood immobile, lost in the thrall. Outside, the wind howled again, and the tower creaked. Somewhere above them, a chunk of stone shifted and groaned, but the hush within their circle remained inviolate. At last, the Night King lowered his hand, stepping back. Viserys remained where he was, body rigid. A faint flicker disturbed his eyes, like a sputtering ember. He blinked once, a slow, halting movement. Then it was gone, swallowed by the cold. The hush felt almost triumphant, as though it had beaten down any resistance that might lurk in the corners of the mind. The Night King turned away, pacing along the line of Whites. He passed each one, scanning them with that eerie calm. None made a sound. In the far corner of the hall, a half-collapsed doorway led into what might have been a storeroom. The Night King swept a hand toward it, and two Whites immediately moved to tear aside the rubble blocking the entrance. Dust and debris shifted, and a broken door slumped inward. Beyond lay a cramped chamber, littered with fallen beams and casks. The Whites entered, rummaging silently through the remnants. They emerged with fragments of decayed supplies, a rusted chain, rotted sacks of grain, an iron poker. The hush did not waver. Though none of these items held much use for the dead, the Night King examined them as though searching for something. His fingers touched the chain, leaving a trail of frost. Then he let it drop. The husk of a cask revealed ancient grain turned to dust, which spilled across the floor. The hush swallowed the whisper of its movement. At last, the Night King lost interest, turning back to the main hall. The Whites followed like shadows. Hours passed, or perhaps it was mere minutes. Without the sun or wind, time had no anchor. The Legion remained eerily still. Some crouched against the walls, others stood in a ring around the perimeter. Viserys stood near the center, each breath non-existent, each twitch governed by the hush. The Night King, enthroned in silence, lingered in the gloom. Now and then, a faint crackle of frost would ripple across the walls. But otherwise, there was no sign of activity. It was an assembly of statues, waiting. Eventually, the hush broke in the faintest way possible. A gentle rasp of shifting stone. Something weighed upon the tower's upper levels. Perhaps the wind outside had changed, pressing against the ice-shrouded walls. A gentle tremor coursed through the floor. The Night King rose from his stillness, gaze turning upward. The Whites stirred, looking to him for guidance. Whatever caused the subtle quiver, It did not seem an immediate threat. The hush settled again, and then came a distant clatter. Rocks or timber slid, dislodging from a higher chamber. Each sound echoed through the tower's hollow interior. The whites in the hall turned their heads in unison, some rising from their crouched positions. Viserys felt the tug of compulsion, though no direct command was given. He stepped toward the spiral staircase, following the unspoken directive. 2 other whites followed. Together, they ascended carefully, boots scraping on frost-laden steps. The hush accompanied them, an ever-present shadow. At the top of the broken stairs, an open landing gave onto a partially collapsed room. Rubble covered the floor, and through a gaping hole in the roof, the swirling night sky was faintly visible. Snow had drifted in, forming mounds among shattered timbers. The hush thickened in this smaller space, as if reluctant to share the domain with the outside wind. Viserys stepped gingerly over a cracked beam, the other whites flanking him. Tiny shards of ice crunched underfoot. The noise had come from above, but the roof seemed stable now. Viserys lifted his face, half of it illuminated by the faint glow that penetrated the gap. Ice crystals shimmered on his pallid skin. Nothing fell this time. No stones, no timber. Perhaps the tower was settling under the weight of new snow. He turned his head mechanically, scanning the chamber. A battered table leaned against one wall, and near it lay a crate with a broken lid. In the hush, any movement felt magnified, as though the smallest shift might echo. But everything stood silent. The whites at his side slowly advanced, stepping around the pile of debris. One bent at the waist, peering into the broken crate. The other turned its head upward, scanning the fractured roof. Viserys stood near the center of the room, body rigid. No swirl of memory broke through. No flicker of the man who once dreamed of a throne. The hush owned him wholly. A faint trickle of snow dust drifted through the open hole. The outside wind moaned, but it was far gentler than the gales that had battered them earlier. Viserys' eyes tracked the falling flakes. For a heartbeat, his expression seemed to waver, as though some primal spark recognized the gentle swirl. Had there been a time in his youth when he stood beneath drifting snow in the Red Keep's courtyards? Or perhaps on the ship that carried him across the narrow sea? If so, the hush erased it, leaving no more than a fleeting ghost. A soft clunk echoed behind him. One of the whites had nudged the table, dislodging a chunk of ice from its surface. It tumbled, struck the floor, and broke. The hush absorbed the sound. Viserys felt the tension in the air subside, as though nothing urgent remained to discover here. Without a word, without a will of his own, he turned and made his way back to the stairwell. The other 2 whites fell in behind him, descending into the hall below. The Legion still waited, a silent congregation in the gloom. The Night King stood at the far side, his eyes reflecting the watery luminescence of the frost-laden walls. When Viserys and the others returned, he regarded them with that inscrutable gaze, gleaning that no threat or revelation lay in the ruin above. A moment passed, measured by the hush. Then the Night King shifted his stance, as though preparing to move again. There was no rest for the dead, no purpose in sheltering beyond convenience. He raised one hand, and an echo of the same icy magic that had sealed the roof flickered at his fingertips. The hush enveloped them all in a thick wave, pressing against the stones with unstoppable will. One by one, the whites turned, heading for the tower's exit. Snow sifted through the gaps in the newly frozen barricade overhead, but the Legion paid it no mind. They marched out into the night, following the path they had carved in the drifts. Viserys was swept along. Once again, the hush swallowed any sense of self. Outside, the storm had lessened. Clouds thinned, revealing the pale shimmer of moonlight on the snow. The valley lay quiet, a tapestry of shadowy hills and silver reflections. The tower behind them slouched in ruin, an afterthought in the endless winter. The hush guided them onward, a silent call that demanded forward motion. The whites spread out, forming ranks as the Night King led them across the open plain. Viserys walked with them, a single pawn in the army of the dead. Their trek took them over frozen streams and through stands of leafless trees. Now and again, they discovered more footprints half erased by drifting flakes. The Night King followed these faint trails with unerring purpose, He seemed bent on seeking every living soul that dared remain in this forsaken land, snuffing them out or adding them to his ever-growing ranks. No matter how far they traveled, the hush reigned, as if the entire world had been plunged under a single command: silence in the shadow of death. In time, they reached another set of hills, each crowned with ice-laden boulders. The wind hissed softly over these stones, carrying the faint resonance of howls from distant wolves. The hush pressed on, rendering those howls as little more than muffled echoes. Viserys and the host climbed each slope, then descended, leaving footprints that swiftly filled with new snow. From hilltop to hilltop, they pressed on. Night bled into day, day into night, but the gloom remained. A few times the sky brightened to a pale gray, but the sun never quite showed its face. The hush was their sun now, an unchanging constant. Occasionally, the Legion encountered the remnants of campsites, abandoned by wanderers who realized too late the futility of staying in these cursed lands. Tents half buried in snow, or the blackened circles of old fires. The hush claimed every trace, smoothing it over with drifts. If the travelers had survived, they were long gone. If they had perished, their bones lay hidden beneath the unrelenting white. The Night King never hesitated. He guided them onward, drawn by instincts older than men's kingdoms. Days continued, or hours, or centuries. It was impossible to measure. The hush rendered all time meaningless, each landscape blending into the next. Viserys felt no boredom, no longing. He felt nothing at all. Memories of Khal Drogo's wrath, of Daenerys' unwavering spirit, of the promised crown, those were phantoms that barely grazed the edges of his awareness. The hush enveloped them, grinding them into dust. If a corner of his mind still harbored the tragedy of his molten gold death, it could not surface in the face of this icy dominion. Yet in the midst of that oblivion, the Night King still tested him from time to time. A subtle gesture might cause a swirl of frost to dance around Viserys' feet, or a ripple of cold to surge through his limbs. Each time, the hush within him swallowed that sensation. No trace of mortal warmth arose. The Targaryen blood, so famed for its link to dragons, lay dormant. Fire had no place here. Still, the Night King's quiet attempts continued, as if some deeper plan hinged on harnessing that lineage. The hush merely watched, silent as a tomb. And so their odyssey continued across the endless snows, each step a chapter in a silent saga of the dead. If there was any corner of the world left untouched by winter, any living kingdom that still believed itself safe, perhaps they would learn too late. The hush moved on, implacable, unstoppable, claiming all. And at the Night King's side strode Viserys Targaryen, bound in ice, a hollow prince with no crown but the cold. Shadows bled over the land as the swirl of flakes consumed the horizon once more, and the hush pressed inward, smothering every whisper of what had once been mortal life. They traveled beneath skies that never truly cleared, locked in a perpetual dance between thick clouds and pale diffused light. Sometimes the horizon lightened into a flat stretch of silver that might have been dawn. At other times, it sank into the deep gray of twilight, or an even blacker embrace of true night. Yet for the dead, it made little difference. They marched on without hesitation, guided by the Night King's silent will, each white's steps eerily synchronized in that unbroken hush. Viserys walked among them as he always did, at the edge of his master's aura, visible when the Night King strode at the center of the formation. He had no need to keep watch or maintain alertness. The hush in his mind was so complete that no stray thought disturbed him. Once in a while, a swirl of wind tossed wet flakes against his face, gathering in the hollow under his eyes. He never blinked them away. He did not breathe or sigh. He simply continued, an echo of the proud youth he had been in life, now a puppet of ancient frost. Ahead, the terrain flattened into a broad expanse of featureless tundra, the snow beaten smooth by relentless gales. Large drifts lay in great mounds, but in other places the ice had crusted so heavily it formed a sheer glassy surface. The wind, once howling, had subsided into a distant hiss, like a massive creature breathing in its sleep. The hush, that living force of silence, accompanied them, absorbing the faint crunch of the dead's footfalls. It was as though the entire world conformed to the Night King's command, muffling every noise. They reached an area where the ground gently sloped downward. Here, a half-frozen river cut across the tundra like a ragged seam. The water lay trapped beneath a thick sheet of ice, though in the center a dark current ran, swirling beneath a jagged gap. The Legion approached, forming a loose semicircle around the bank. Several whites drifted forward, stepping onto the ice to test its strength. Beneath their feet, cracks spiderwebbed, but the surface held. One white slipped, lurching awkwardly, but it made no sound, no groan of pain. It simply regained balance and moved on, carrying out the silent directive. Viserys stood at the Night King's flank, staring at the reflection of sky and snow in the ice. He recognized none of it in a conscious way. There was only that blank acceptance. Another silent command rippled through the hush, and the army began to cross. Their footsteps scraped the frozen water in unison. The ice groaned now and then, but did not break. Viserys could have been leading or following. He himself did not know. The hush assured him that there was no difference. Midway across, a random current below the ice popped, sending a dull crack reverberating outward. Several whites paused, heads swiveling as though to locate the origin, but the hush dragged them onward. Viserys glanced down mechanically. Beneath his boots, black water rushed beneath the ice's milky surface. Something stirred in that dark current, perhaps a fish or a swirl of debris. He felt no curiosity. There was only a blank, unbroken stillness in his mind. Reaching the far bank, they filed onto packed snow. From here, the ground rose steeply into crags, topped by a low scattering of evergreens. Their branches sagged with ice, needles encased in glittering layers that caught the faint light like shards of quartz. The Night King surveyed the slope, lifting his face as though testing the air. He neither halted nor gave a signal to rest. Those concepts were meaningless to him and to the undead that followed. Instead, he led them upward, weaving between thick stands of trees. The hush turned oppressive in the forest gloom. Needles occasionally snapped underfoot, but the sound was swallowed by the thick drifts and the hush that cloaked them all. The whites fanned out, forming a rough line, each figure stepping around half-buried trunks and fallen branches. Some of the older trees bore thick lichens, frozen and brittle. The hush made them appear as petrified shapes, stuck in the same silent vigil as the whites themselves. High above, the wind rattled the treetops, shaking clumps of snow free. Now and again, the flakes tumbled down in sudden flurries, drifting like ghostly veils around the undead. Viserys blinked slowly whenever stray flakes fell across his lashes, but it was a purely physical reaction, devoid of thought. His dead heart did not pound in his chest, nor did heat gather in his limbs from the effort of climbing. The hush enveloped him, deeper than the gloom. Eventually, they reached a clearing near the crest of the ridge. Here, a scattering of broken stones suggested someone, long ago, had tried to build a wall or a foundation. Now only these frost-bitten remnants remained. In the center rose the charred stump of a tree that had once been massive. Lightning, fire, or some other calamity had split it, leaving behind a jagged trunk. Snow piled around its base, and icicles dangled from the blackened wood. The hush weighed heavily. Several whites gathered around the trunk, their eyes reflecting the azure glow of unlife. They stood as though waiting for an unspoken directive. Perhaps this place offered a vantage point, or perhaps the Night King sensed some trace of the living. If that was so, no trace remained now. A sweeping gust rattled the trees, then fell silent. The hush expanded, as if seizing every corner of the clearing. The Night King moved on, leaving the stump behind. The whites followed, Viserys with them, streaming through the clearing in a slow, measured procession. The hush pressed around them like a physical thing, preventing all but the faintest rustle of movement. Soon the trees thinned, and the slope led them to a plateau of rock rising above the surrounding forest. Snow had drifted thickly here, but patches of stone protruded, forming a slick path that wound around the plateau's edge. Without hesitation, the Legion approached. One by one, they stepped onto the path, The drop on either side was steep, a tumble that would lead to a craggy ravine below. For a living traveler, it would have been perilous. The wind battered the dead, carrying flecks of ice that stung even their lifeless skin. Yet none paused or faltered, their balance sustained by the unwavering directive that commanded them. Viserys moved with the same uncanny steadiness, the hush in his mind drowning out the concept of fear. They reached the plateau's summit, which was surprisingly level. Ancient, weathered stones hinted at an altar or dais, half buried under centuries of accumulated winter. It might have been built by a distant people, or left behind by those who came before the first men. None of that mattered now. The hush treated all remnants of history with equal indifference. The Night King surveyed the surroundings, eyes narrowed in the soft glow of the overcast sky. A single breath of wind lifted the tattered folds of his black garments, revealing glimpses of icy armor beneath. Across the plateau, the whites gathered. Some circled the edges, peering down into the ravine, though they did so without emotion. Others stood motionless, turned toward the Night King as if waiting for the next command. Viserys was among those, his face expressionless, his arms slack at his sides. The hush soaked into every silent breath he did not draw, saturating him with the same cold gravity that emanated from their master. Time slipped past, marked only by the changing hues of the sky. The faint gray overhead shifted toward the color of evening. Dusk, or perhaps the onset of a new storm, bled across the horizon, casting the snow in pale lavender shadows. The hush seemed to expand as darkness encroached, wrapping the plateau in a silent vigil. The Night King, unmoving, fixed his gaze on the southern distance, as though calculating the path ahead. Eventually, the wind returned with a sharp gust, swirling snow around the plateau's edges. The Night King turned, leading the legion back the way they had come. Carefully, they traversed the narrow path, drifts parting beneath their feet in ragged lines. No white slipped, though the ledge was treacherous. By the time they reached the tree line again, the light had faded into a dim twilight. The hush thrived in that gloom, making every shape appear ephemeral. They navigated down the slope toward lower ground. More stands of evergreens clustered around the base, thickening into a denser forest. The hush allowed no birdsong, no rustle of hidden creatures, for in the presence of this army, the living had learned to hide or flee. The Legion's passage was a funeral parade of silhouettes weaving between silent trunks. Occasionally, a broken branch would snap underfoot, but it was swallowed at once, leaving the hush unbroken. In time, they came upon a small stream, water trickling beneath an overhang of ice. Here, the ground had thawed slightly, forming a watery channel that meandered toward deeper woods. Around its edges, clumps of reeds rose from the frozen mud. At a glance, it seemed desolate, yet the Night King halted, turning his head. His whites spread out in a crescent, scanning for movement. The hush felt charged, as though the air itself anticipated confrontation. A soft scuff broke the stillness, the sound of a boot scraping frozen ground. It came from behind a scrubby cluster of evergreen branches near the stream. The hush surged, directing the whites forward. They moved with inhuman swiftness, converging on the cluster in a silent wave. Viserys followed, though he showed no outward sign of urgency. In moments, the whites pulled aside the branches to reveal two trembling figures cowering in the snow. They were ragged, half-starved, their faces streaked with grime. One was a woman with hollow cheeks, clutching a blade that might once have been a fine dagger. The other was a boy scarcely old enough to shave, his eyes dull with exhaustion. They jerked back, pressing themselves against the trunk of a gnarled pine as the whites closed in. The hush devoured any attempt at words, their voices choked in terror. The boy lifted a hand as if to plead for mercy. No command was needed. The Night King gazed upon them with that icy detachment, and the legion moved. They scrambled to their feet, but the whites closed ranks too quickly. The woman thrust her dagger at a white's chest, the blade catching in frozen ribs. There was no blood, only a snap as the rusted hilt broke under her frantic strength. Another white seized her wrist, twisting it with mechanical precision. She gave a hoarse cry, barely audible above the wind. The hush seemed to savor the sound, swallowing it before it could echo. Viserys watched from a few steps away. In life, he might have exulted in a display of power. Once cruelty had held a bitter appeal to him. But now, there was nothing in his eyes. No flicker of satisfaction. He moved closer only when the hush prodded him to do so. The boy stumbled backward, lost his footing in the icy slush, and collapsed at Viserys' feet. A faint whimper escaped him, more out of instinct than hope. Viserys bent down, skeletal fingers reaching for the boy's collar. His grip held no gentleness. He lifted the boy upright, ignoring the ragged breath that escaped the living chest. The hush pressed them both, unstoppable. Nearby, the whites dragged the woman to her knees. She stared at the Night King's pale visage, eyes wide, lips forming a silent plea that never reached her tongue. The hush stifled any last words. With grim efficiency, the whites ended her mortal life, then turned to the boy. There was no drama to it, no ceremony, only the same mechanical finality that attended every kill. Viserys dropped him, and the hush swallowed the last small sound. The legion stood ringed around the fallen, a circle of empty stares and half-rotted faces. When it was done, the Night King lingered, peering down at the bodies. If either possessed the slightest spark of significance, it would be harnessed. A subtle raising of his arm conveyed the command. The hush swept over the corpses, a tide of cold that slithered across the snow. The woman twitched first, limbs jerking in unnatural spasms. The boy's chest rose one last time, though no true breath filled his lungs, only the hush crawling in. Soon they too had eyes of cold blue. They stood, stiff and silent, yet fully enslaved by the frigid will that controlled them. The legion parted, allowing the newly risen whites to join the formation. There was no exchange, no orientation beyond the silent bond they shared. Death had stripped them of everything but their enforced obedience. The hush enveloped them, smoothing any ragged edges of fear or defiance. Then, the Night King advanced once more, leading them onward through the forest. Viserys fell in step, the hush wrapped tight around his mind, permitting no echoes of thought. They walked until the sky began to lighten again. A suggestion of dawn or midday filtered through the clouds, though it brought no warmth. The forest opened into a marshy stretch. Ice-coated reeds rattled in the breeze, clumps of black mud poking through patches of half-frozen water. The whites stepped carefully, but there was no real danger. If one of them sank, it would only claw its way free under the Night King's direction, or it would remain half-buried until summoned. Even the terrain offered no true barrier. At last, the marsh gave way to drier ground. They ascended a shallow slope that overlooked a white plain broken by stunted vegetation. Across that plain loomed the faint outline of a settlement, just a scattering of huts and a wooden palisade battered by age. Smoke curled from a single chimney, though it was barely visible against the dim sky. Perhaps a handful of survivors eked out a living there, unaware that doom approached in the hush of the undead. The whites paused behind a cluster of snow-laden bushes, as though waiting for a final sign. The hush throbbed around them, an almost tangible tension. The Night King regarded the distant settlement with his cold, ancient gaze. This close to the edges of the far north, few enclaves remained. Those who had not fled south had learned to hide well, but apparently not well enough. He lifted an arm. The hush translated his motion into immediate action. The legion advanced in a loose formation, some skirting to the right, others to the left, forming a pincer that would encircle the settlement. Viserys followed with the central group, his footsteps leaving shallow prints in the snow. As they neared, the huts grew more distinct, revealing patched walls of timber and stacked stones. A single gate stood open in the makeshift palisade, though it looked sturdy enough to keep out wild animals. It would not keep out the dead. The hush pressed forward, accompanied by the crunch of a few boots on frosted ground. The living inside had no chance to raise an alarm before a cluster of whites slipped through the gate. Viserys entered the settlement with them, drifting past the gate as if crossing into an empty courtyard. In fact, it was a simple clearing, ringed by huts. Two scrawny goats bolted at the sight of the intruders, bleating in panic and skittering off between buildings. A pot of something stew-like bubbled on an outdoor hearth. Nearby, a man in a leather cloak froze, ladle in hand. He gaped, dropping the ladle into the pot with a clang. Then he turned to shout. He never finished the word. A white seized him from behind. Skeletal fingers clamped across his mouth. The hush drowned out any attempt at speech. He thrashed, slapping at the grasping arms, until a second white yanked him back. Viserys watched in distant silence. Once he might have smirked at another's terror, or felt revulsion at such violence, but now he felt nothing. The hush consumed all. The man vanished under a wave of undead arms, his final struggles lost in the swirl of snow. A door to one of the huts burst open, revealing a startled woman clutching a small child. On seeing the Legion, she slammed the door shut and barred it with a wooden plank. Another white hammered against the planks, each blow relentless, ignoring the woman's muffled cries from within. The hush felt like a pressure, urging each white to carry out the unstoppable plan. Another white circled around, searching for a second entrance or a weak point in the wooden structure. Somewhere else in the settlement, a cluster of men armed with makeshift clubs and knives attempted to rally near the gate. They shouted commands, their breath steaming in the cold, but the hush swallowed every note, turning them into frantic gestures. They hadn't the numbers or skill to challenge the undead. The first wave of whites descended, and the men's hasty formation dissolved. One fell to a blow from a white's fist, collapsing in a heap. Another had his club wrenched away before being shoved to the ground. It was over within moments, the hush blanketing all. In front of one hut, a heavier door swung open, and a gray-haired elder emerged. He wore a tattered cloak over rough-spun clothes, a short hunting spear clutched in trembling hands. Immediately, he saw the swarming dead, and his eyes flicked up to the tallest figure among them. The Night King stood a few yards away, motionless, face carved from ice, gaze fixed on the elder. The old man's spear quivered. Slowly the hush coiled around him like a serpent. If he had words, they died on his tongue. He fell to his knees, shaking his head in mute denial. The hush gave him no mercy. A single white advanced from behind, grabbing his shoulder. The old man let the spear slip from his grasp. The hush consumed his last breath. Meanwhile, Viserys approached the hut where the woman and child hid. A portion of the wall looked as though it had been hastily repaired, boards nailed over a gap. The hush guided him forward. He gripped one board, numb hands drawing on unnatural strength, and tore it free with a loud crack. Splinters rained onto the snow. The hush pressed in, devouring the woman's stifled gasp from inside. He ripped another board, revealing a gap large enough to see through. The woman crouched within, arms wrapped around the child, her face etched with terror. She locked eyes with Viserys. In that instant, she might have seen the Targaryen features. Pale hair, once regal posture, twisted into a mask of empty lifelessness. Her lips moved, forming a rapid prayer or plea, but the hush devoured her words. With mechanical precision, Viserys wedged his arm through the gap, reaching for the door latch from the inside. The woman tried to swat him away, but her blows had no force to deter an undead body. His fingers found the latch. The door swung inward, letting the storm of death roll inside. The child cried, a small, desperate sound. The hush drank it, muffling the terror. Viserys seized the woman by the shoulder, dragging her upright. She clawed at his face, leaving faint scratches on his frozen skin. His expression never changed. The hush commanded him to hold her. Another white slipped around them, plucking the child from the corner. The child's arms flailed, but found no rescue in a world emptied of mercy. Outside, the last of the settlement's defenders fell. A handful of whites moved from hut to hut, searching for survivors. One man tried to climb the palisade, hoping to flee, but a silent figure pulled him down before he could swing a leg over. He disappeared in the swirl of limbs, the hush swallowing all cries. The goats, cornered by more whites, scrambled in vain. Another moment, and they too went still. Soon the entire place lay under the dominion of the hush. Bodies littered the snow, some in contorted poses, others in small clusters where they had tried to stand together. The Night King strode through the carnage, ignoring the scattered fires that smoldered in stone pits. Nothing here could burn enough to matter. Where life had existed minutes ago, only the hush thrived now. The whites pulled the corpses into a clearing, forming a ragged mound of silent dead. Viserys and a few others guided the living captives, those not yet slain or who had surrendered in shock, into the same area, hurting them without a single word. 5 living souls remained, huddled together in the snow, disarmed and trembling. The woman and child were among them, as well as 2 younger men and a woman with a bandaged leg. Their faces revealed that all hope had fled. The hush settled around them like an iron cage. The Night King regarded them in that timeless silence. His eyes, like shards of glacial blue, roamed over each in turn. He raised his hand, and one of the men collapsed to his knees, whimpering, arms shielding his face. There would be no release. 3 whites came forward, mechanical in their motions. One grabbed the bandaged woman by the arms, pressing her down. She tried to fight, but exhaustion stole her strength. The hush demanded submission. Another white pulled the child away from the mother. The child's tiny hand slipped out of her grasp, leaving her sobbing, though no sound emerged from her parted lips. Viserys watched impassively, his eyes passing over the scene as if it were a painting beyond his comprehension. Like so many times before, the hush coaxed out the final spark of life and smothered it. The mother fell limp, as a blow from a white ended her struggle. The men, pinned and outnumbered, offered no meaningful resistance. The hush swallowed them all. Only the child remained, a small figure kneeling in the snow, face pale, tears frozen on her cheeks. She stared at the Night King, eyes wide, seemingly beyond tears. He took a single step toward her. For an awful moment, it looked like he might simply crush her skull underfoot. But he paused. The hush became almost tangible, thickening the air. A subtle flicker crossed Viserys' vision, as if some memory tried to claw its way to the surface. An echo of the time he had raged at his sister Daenerys, or perhaps the fleeting memory of a small child on a ship to Bravos. But it never took shape. The hush snuffed it out, as swiftly as it appeared. The Night King stared at the child, with the same blank animus he held for all living things. Then he raised his hand. A swirl of cold magic gathered around him, a vortex of invisible power that made the snow lift in gentle spirals. The child seemed too petrified to move. Gradually, her cheeks lost color, her eyes dulled. A weak moan escaped her lips, soon strangled by the hush. The life that remained in her chest flickered like a dying candle flame. Viserys watched as the hush enveloped her, draining the last spark of warmth from her. When she slumped forward, no breath stirred from her tiny body. One white, responding to the Night King's unspoken command, knelt to raise the child's limp form. The hush inhaled, then exhaled a wave of frigid compulsion. The child's limbs jerked. Her eyes opened, that same icy glow glinting where mortal terror had been. No cry, no voice, only the hush. Another white set her on her feet. She wavered for a moment, as though still too small to stand. One might think the Night King would ignore such a fragile vessel, but he watched carefully, verifying that his power had taken root. Then he turned aside, sure of his victory. Meanwhile, the other corpses lay scattered. Some began to twitch, already in the first throes of reanimation. Others would take longer if their injuries were more severe. Eventually, they would all rise. The hush permitted no rest for the dead. No pyres would burn here to set them free. Soon, the entire settlement would stand again, its denizens now members of the Legion. They would follow the Night King's footsteps, part of the unstoppable tide. When the last of the living had been slaughtered or brought over to death's ranks, the Night King lifted his gaze. The hush guided his gaze toward the horizon. The world lay under deep gloom, but far away, the sky sometimes carried the faint glow of ephemeral sunrise. Only illusions. The hush demanded darkness, demanded that all corners of creation succumb to its silence. And the Night King knew precisely where to walk next. He strode out of the settlement, heading southeast, and the Legion followed. The whites that had been created moments before shuffled to join the formation. They wore fresh blood on their clothes, on their hands, but the hush dulled any sheen to dark patches of congealing matter. Some limped, others had arms twisted at gruesome angles. It mattered not. The hush swallowed agony and replaced it with duty. They marched in an ever-expanding column. Viserys took his customary place near the Night King's side, hair plastered to his scalp with frost, eyes vacant of any emotion. Behind them, the snow continued to fall, covering the ruined settlement in a soft blanket. Soon, only lumps of debris remained visible, a testament to the unstoppable force that had swept through. No voices lingered, no ghostly sobs. The hush had devoured every cry. The wind, too, fell silent around the scene, as though even the weather recognized it was pointless to scream against this tide of death. As the legion moved onward, the land began a gradual shift from forest and marsh to rolling hills, their ridges covered in wind-scoured snow. Over countless hours, the hush deepened, saturating every moment with an eerie sense of timelessness. Now and again, the Night King would halt, scanning the distance. Sometimes, he detected faint traces of living souls. The legion would adjust course, crossing the ridges to search. Most often, they found nothing. The hush seemed to chase off all life. Or else the living had fled somewhere beyond these northern expanses. Yet he never gave up his search, for his intent was to extinguish every flicker of mortal breath that lingered. While crossing one such ridge, a wight slipped on a patch of ice and plummeted into a deep crevice. The hush accepted that mishap with indifference. The rest of the legion continued without pause. If the wight remained salvageable, it would either crawl out eventually or be retrieved by some future whim of the Night King. If not, its second death would be just as silent as the first. One fewer soldier hardly mattered. The hush had an endless appetite. Viserys noticed none of this as separate events. Each moment blended seamlessly into the next, a continuous chain of motion fueled by a relentless will. He did not tire. He did not question. His stiff limbs carried him forward, matching the Night King's stride. Once in a while he might tilt his head at a sound or glimpse movement at the edge of vision, but it was reflex without thought. The hush had stripped him of volition. They continued like this for what might have been days. The sky moved through its pallid transitions, from dull gray to watery black, from black to pale gray again. Wind scoured them. Storms occasionally rose to pelt them with freezing sleet, but always the hush pressed on. The legion's ranks continued to swell in incremental increments, as scattered pockets of survivors were discovered and slaughtered. Each new wight merged seamlessly into the formation, giving no more than a vacant stare to the ones that came before. In the quiet interlude between storms, the clouds parted just long enough to reveal a slice of night sky lit by countless stars. The hush softened for a moment, as if allowing the realm to witness the beauty of frozen constellations. The Night King raised his face to the heavens, eyes glimmering with ancient knowledge. Viserys stood near him, also gazing upward, though no wonder touched his features. If a memory of starry nights in warmer lands stirred, the hush drowned it immediately. His dead eyes saw only faint lights in an endless black. The wind began to moan again, swallowing the stars. Clouds drifted across the night, thickening into another storm. The hush flared once more, beckoning them onward. They descended into another valley, where a wide stream had frozen in elaborate patterns. At the far end of this valley, black ridges rose, the foothills of a looming mountain range. Perhaps beyond those peaks lay the domain of living kingdoms, still unaware of the doom creeping toward them. The hush would cross those mountains in time, unstoppable. They reached the edge of the stream and tested the ice. It held. Marching across, they passed lumps of broken rock and boulders half embedded in the frozen water. A swirl of wind whipped snow into their faces, but none raised an arm to shield themselves. They simply pressed forward, mechanical, unwavering. On the opposite bank, the ground sloped upward into the foothills. Thin stands of birch trees, their trunks chalk white, rattled softly in the breeze. A hush, deeper than the darkness itself, expanded, nearly tangible, as the Night King led his legion among them. Higher and higher they climbed, weaving through narrow passes and over ridges that overlooked precipitous drops. No light burned in the distance. No watchfires or torches signaled the presence of living souls. It felt as though the entire region had been abandoned to winter's merciless rule. Yet the hush would never assume that all had fled. It searched methodically, commanding them to explore each hollow, each small plateau, where a hut might hide. Eventually, they discovered a lone structure nestled at the base of a sheer cliff. It appeared to be a storehouse of some kind, built of thick wooden planks reinforced with rock. Smoke rose from a narrow chimney, a steady plume that dispersed into the swirling sky. A faint glow pulsed behind shuttered windows. The hush resonated with possibility. The Night King paused, eyes fixed upon the chimney. Even from this distance, he could sense warm blood pumping. A silent command spread through the whites, and they began to converge on the building. Like predators approaching unsuspecting prey, they fanned out, trudging across the uneven terrain without a sound. Viserys moved with them, half lost in the hush. He felt the pull of that living warmth, though it did not awaken hunger in him, only an inevitable compulsion to extinguish it. They advanced upon the storehouse until a single flicker of movement behind one shutter signaled that someone had heard or sensed them. A faint voice called out, muffled but tense. The hush responded by sweeping the whites faster into formation, surrounding the building. At once, the door flew open. A man stood in the threshold, carrying a torch in one hand and a short sword in the other. He scanned the pale shapes surrounding him, and his expression twisted in dread. Without waiting, he hurled the torch at the nearest whites, hoping the flames might startle them. Embers scattered across the snow, illuminating a few rotting faces and empty eyes. They didn't recoil or flinch. Another figure, a woman, appeared behind the man, clutching a bow. She fired an arrow that sank into a white's shoulder. It kept advancing. The hush devoured any courage they might have summoned. 3 whites rushed the door, forcing it wide open. The man shouted frantically, pushing one away with his blade, but a second closed in, grappling his arms. The flame of the discarded torch flickered in the snow, sputtering. The hush swallowed up the man's grunts, reducing his voice to a hoarse whisper. Another white disarmed the woman with a blow to her wrist, sending the bow spinning away. Viserys entered through the open door, stepping across a threadbare rug. Inside, the storehouse was cramped but well supplied. Rows of clay jars lined one wall. Sacks of grain stacked against another. A small table with stools stood near the hearth, where a low fire crackled. 2 more people, older by their stooped postures, pressed themselves against the wall at the sight of the undead legion. Terror shone in their eyes. The hush thickened, pressing in from all corners. No one dared speak, as if the hush had stolen language itself. The man tried to break free from the white's grip, but another pair joined in, wrenching his arms behind his back. He let out a strangled cry, glancing at the woman who had lost her bow. She, too, was held by multiple dead hands. The hush had no patience for lengthy struggles. One white slammed the man's head against the wooden doorframe. Blood slicked the wood, and he collapsed, unconscious or dead. The hush cared little which it was. Viserys turned his gaze on the older pair. One made a futile dash for a small side door, but a white seized him before he could take more than 2 steps. The other, a woman with a deeply lined face, pressed back against the wall, hands raised in a trembling plea. Her mouth moved, forming words that never escaped. The hush devoured them, leaving only silence. Viserys felt that ripple of compulsion. He advanced, hooking a stiff hand around her shoulder. She sank to her knees, tears sliding down her cheeks. Behind him, the whites pinned the rest of the household. In moments, it was finished. The hush swallowed the final cry, the final spasm of life. The fire in the hearth guttered, a few weak flames licking at the last remains of wood. The storehouse grew as silent as any tomb. Whatever supplies these people had gathered would remain, now useless to them, in death. The hush claimed every inch. One by one the fallen stirred, eyes shifting from lifeless to the cold glow of undeath, until the storehouse's inhabitants stood among the legion, their faces transformed by the endless winter. The whites extinguished the hearth flame with a heavy kick, scattering embers. Smoke curled in a lazy swirl, then dissipated. Snow piled on the threshold from the open door, and the hush pressed outward again, summoning them back into the night. They marched out in single file. Viserys trailed after the newly risen, stepping back into the wind's domain. Clouds thickened overhead, promising more snowfall. The hush led them on, subduing every living spark it encountered. They advanced higher into the foothills, forging a path through narrow passes. At times, the slopes were so steep that the whites half-crawled, grasping icy rocks for purchase. Yet none slipped or faltered enough to break the hush's momentum. Even Viserys, who in life had never been a seasoned traveler, found each step dictated by unholy strength. He did not pant or sweat. He did not fear the drop below. The hush bound him to the single purpose of climbing. When at last they crested a ridge, a breathtaking vista sprawled before them, valleys and mountains fading into a horizon of wintry haze. The hush had devoured every settlement they'd encountered, turning them into ghostly expansions of the Legion. Perhaps more hamlets hid beyond these slopes, or perhaps entire towns lay waiting. The Night King surveyed the distance, his expression unreadable. A stray gust lifted the ragged edges of his cloak, revealing glimpses of pale flesh beneath. If he felt triumph, it was as cold and silent as everything else about him. Below, at the far end of a winding trail, a scattering of lights flickered in the gloom. A settlement larger than a mere homestead, perhaps a walled village or a small fort. If so, it might harbor more survivors. The hush stirred with faint anticipation. Already, the whites turned their heads, as though drawn by an invisible scent. Without hesitation, the Night King began his descent. The hush was all the impetus they needed. Viserys followed, stepping carefully over loose scree. Around him, new and old whites alike marched in that same uncanny unity. He did not question or think of turning away. Though House Targaryen had once stirred with the fury of dragons, all that remained was this bleak puppet animated by Winter's command. The hush consumed every vestige of the man who had demanded a crown of molten gold. Now he had a crown of silence. He was a prince of the dead. Snow fluttered, swirling around them as they made their way toward the next target. The hush preceded them like a wave, draining the world of sound and life. Each step, each motion, was a chapter in a saga that rewrote the realm in endless cold. Eventually, the hush would reach the far corners of the kingdoms, but for now, it sufficed to spread its domain incrementally. And so they traveled, a silent army under the watchful guidance of the Night King. Night fell again, or day broke. It hardly mattered. Time had no claim in this white wilderness. The hush was eternal, unchanging, a force that dwarfed mortal comprehension. Clouds thickened overhead, and the first flakes of a new storm drifted down, nestling in Viserys' hair, in the hollows of the whites' eyes. Ahead lay the glow of a settlement, the promise of more living souls to claim. The hush deepened, eager, relentless. They reached the outskirts of a forest that encircled the settlement. The trees here were thicker, forming a natural barrier. Torches flickered along a rudimentary barrier wall. From a distance, one could see the silhouette of wooden watchtowers, though only a couple, small and poorly manned. The hush delighted in the fear that would soon overtake the watchmen, for fear was a flavor it consumed as readily as flesh. The Night King signaled, and the legion spread out. Viserys took a path to the right, leading a contingent of whites through dense undergrowth, not by choice, but by the unstoppable pull of the hush. The wind rustled the branches, or perhaps that rustling was the hush itself, licking at the edges of the forest. In the watchtowers, a pair of shapes moved, scanning the dark. They might have glimpsed a pale figure or two. They called out, voices muffled by distance, but not so far that the hush couldn't feel their presence. The whites pressed forward, using the cover of the trees. Low brambles caught on tattered clothes and rotted flesh, but they tore through without pain or pause. The hush guided them to a patch of ground where the palisade was weaker, where the watchman's torch could not reach. The group of whites with Viserys included a tall figure missing half a jaw, another with a gaping chest wound, and three more that had died only recently, wearing furs and a single battered piece of armor. They set upon the wall, prying at logs, searching for gaps. Several yards away, the Night King led another group to the settlement's main gate. The hush coordinated these movements like a choreographed dance. The watchmen above the gate spotted the dead too late, but they managed to sound a ragged horn blast. In the hush, it was a thin, feeble note that died nearly as soon as it rose. Nonetheless, a flurry of activity stirred inside the walls. Frantic shouts, scuffling feet, the clang of weapons hastily drawn. Torches flared brighter. People rushed about, trying to coordinate defenses. Viserys and his group found a weak point in the palisade. Logs loosened by winter's wear. With undead strength, they tore at the wooden posts, rocking them until nails snapped. The hush surged, lending them impetus. Under the watchful glow of a wavering torch high above, they pulled a section of the wall aside, ripping an opening wide enough for several wights to slip through. 2 watchmen noticed, raining a few arrows down. One arrow lodged in the shoulder of a wight, but it did nothing to slow it. The hush propelled them forward, unstoppable. Viserys stepped through the opening, eyes fixed on the nearest shapes of living defenders. A breathless hush welled up, intensifying. The watchmen knocked arrows frantically, letting them fly. But each arrow only embedded in undead flesh. More wights poured in behind him. The settlement's interior was a chaotic sprawl of huts and lanes. A few men rushed forward with spears, trying to block the incursion. They managed to skewer one wight, pinning it momentarily. But the hush gave the others time to surround them. At the same moment, the main gate exploded inward under the combined assault of wights, led by the Night King himself. Panic seized the defenders caught between 2 advancing tides of death. Torches cast wavering shadows that made the dead appear even more grotesque. Shouts of alarm filled the air, quickly smothered by the hush as wights closed in. Some defenders fought bravely, others threw down weapons and ran. None truly escaped. The hush was relentless, rolling through the narrow lanes in a wave of silent terror. Viserys engaged a pair of defenders armed with crude swords. Their eyes flicked over his pale features, likely noticing the unnatural hue of his hair, the empty stare. They struck out, one blade scraping across his ribs. A living man would have reeled in pain, but the hush consumed all sensation. Viserys simply reached for the nearest attacker with both hands, clamping them around the man's arm. He twisted in a violent jerk. Bones cracked. The man crumpled with a strangled gasp. His companion lunged, sword aimed at Viserys' heart. Viserys turned, letting the blade graze his side as he seized the man's wrist, wrenching the weapon away. Another wight lunged from behind, tackling the second defender to the ground. The hush devoured their cries. Here and there, pockets of resistance flared. A small group managed to barricade themselves inside a barn, nailing the doors shut. But wights clambered onto the roof, ripping at the shingles until they could drop inside. Others used axes stolen from fallen defenders to hack at the doors. The hush pressed them from all sides, a net of living death. Even the watchmen perched in their towers found themselves isolated as wights ascended ladders or simply tore apart the tower supports from below. The entire settlement collapsed into panic, overshadowed by the hush. By the time the first flickers of dawn touched the eastern sky, the place was in ruins. Dozens lay dead in the lanes, some pinned under overturned carts, others collapsed in corners where they had attempted to hide. The hush drew their last rattling breaths into silence, then replaced them with the cold glow of undeath. Over and over it played out the same scene. The newly fallen trembling with death throes, then stirring once more to rise and join the legion. By that hour, nearly every soul had been claimed. The Night King surveyed the aftermath from near the collapsed gate. Smoke rose from small fires that had been tipped over or left unattended, the faint stench of burnt wood mingling with the acrid tang of fresh blood. Wights shuffled amid the wreckage, dragging bodies into piles. Now and then, a last whimper or sob broke free from a hidden survivor, swiftly silenced by an unthinking blow. Viserys watched without expression, the hush as pervasive in him as the cold. When the final cries ceased, the hush grew absolute once more. The new ranks of wights assembled in the courtyard, standing in neat lines despite their tattered states. Limbs dangled from some, but they remained upright. Eyes glowed an uncanny blue in the dim dawn light. The hush bound them all together, a single entity, under the Night King's dominion. Slowly, he turned away from the settlement, stepping back out through the shattered gate. One by one, the wights fell into formation behind him, leaving the blood-soaked lanes to the swirling wind. They marched onward into the nascent sunrise, though the sun itself remained hidden behind thick layers of cloud. The hush offered neither warmth nor respite, only an endless journey. Viserys walked near the front, each step as sure as the last. The hush in him was permanent, as was his servitude. If any shadow of memory tried to stir, some recollection of Daenerys, of dragons, or the throne he had once coveted, it was quickly crushed by the unstoppable presence that ruled him. The day unfolded in a monotony of gray light and swirling snow. They passed more hills and rocky outcrops, each one bearing the scars of harsh winters. The whites never slackened pace. Now and again, they caught glimpses of distant wildlife, emaciated wolves or ravens circling overhead. Most creatures, sensing the hush, fled. Only scavengers hovered, occasionally bold enough to trail the legion in the hope of picking at remains. The hush gave them no easy opportunity. If they ventured too close, the whites would seize them, turning them into fresh additions to the undead host. But more often, the ravens circled from afar, cawing in dissonant tones. Even that cawing sounded strangled in the hush's domain. Hours, days, the entire concept of time blurred. The Night King led them through a series of valleys, each with a thin stream or a frozen lake. They discovered occasional traces of older roads, half buried in drifts, indicating they crept closer to lands once traversed by travelers or traders. Their unstoppable march spelled doom for any living souls who might remain. The hush willed it so. As they descended another ridge, the wind rose, howling in savage gusts that blew stinging flakes into their faces. Icy needles pelted skin and bone. None faltered. The hush and the Night King's will were more potent than any storm. Step by step, they advanced into the gale, forging onward into the swirling gloom. Snow whipped around Viserys, swirling in eddies about his legs, collecting in the hollows of his long-dead features. He felt nothing. Eventually, the storm abated, revealing an open plain that stretched ahead for miles. In the center loomed the dark shape of a river, broader than any they had crossed so far. Ice chunks drifted in the current, and the banks were lined with jagged shards of frozen ground. The hush pressed them forward. The Night King paused at the edge, studying the flow. The river's center was not fully frozen, and the waters churned violently in the pale light. Yet none among the legion hesitated. They had crossed countless obstacles already. This would be no different. One white ventured onto the ice near the bank, testing its thickness. A loud snap echoed, and the white plunged through, vanishing in a splash. The hush swallowed any notion of alarm. Another tried a different spot, stepping gingerly. The ice held. The water seeped around the edges. The hush urged them to spread out, searching for a stable crossing. Viserys followed suit, drifting along the bank until he came upon a stretch of ice anchored by a massive boulder that jutted into the river's path. The hush compelled him to try. He placed one foot on the ice, then another. The surface groaned, but did not give way. He advanced step by step, arms slightly out to maintain balance. Behind him, more whites followed, each testing the ice as they went. Some found weaker patches, plunging to vanish in the roiling current below, their unnatural lights flickering out. Others managed to reach the large boulder, clinging to it like insects. Viserys slipped once, nearly dropping to one knee, but the hush stiffened his limbs, allowing him to recover. Another few steps, and he was level with the boulder's flat side, where the ice seemed thicker. From the center of the river, a crack reverberated, a gunshot echo in the hush. Several whites tumbled in, carried away by the current, limbs flailing soundlessly. The hush gave them no rescue. The rest pressed on, unthinking. Viserys, guided by that inexorable pull, circled around the boulder. He felt the ice shift under his feet. A deep fracture raked across the surface, but it held long enough for him to pass. Behind him, more whites replicated his steps, forming a precarious chain. After what felt like an interminable crossing, the vanguard of the undead reached the far bank. The Night King himself strode forth, each step on the ice as sure as if it were solid ground. Behind him, whites continued to slip and vanish. Some fought to crawl back onto the ice, their stiff fingers scrabbling at slick edges. A few succeeded, rejoining the legion. Others lost their grip, sucked away into black waters. The hush did not mourn. It was a force of endless supply, unstoppable. Eventually, enough crossed to maintain a formidable host. Even with those lost to the currents, the legion was large, bolstered by every settlement's fallen. On the far shore, they reassembled, a silent wave of silhouettes. Viserys stood among them, battered by wind and crusted in fresh ice. The hush reigned in him, giving no sign of relief or reflection. The crossing was done, no different than all the other obstacles they had conquered. Without pause, the Night King led them up a gentle slope. The plain stretched on, pockmarked with frozen ponds and occasional rocky outcroppings. Dawn or dusk tinted the distant clouds in pale gold, but no sun broke through to warm the land. The hush glided across the frigid expanse, devouring the hours and miles. Viserys moved in unison, bound to the will of the ancient darkness he now served. And so their odyssey continued, unstoppable, across every obstacle that dared rise before them. Whether it was a ravine, a fortress, or a high peak, the hush advanced. Living souls, if they lingered, would either flee or be consumed. The hush had no concept of pity, no capacity for negotiation. Step by step, the legion marched on, the Night King at its head. Among them walked Viserys Targaryen, an echo of the house that once rode dragons, now no more than a shadow cast by the creeping night. Far beyond, perhaps, the world stirred with rumors, tales of undead terror, of a silent host sweeping down from the bitter north, of a power that overcame even the bravery of mortal hearts. Perhaps watchfires were lit on distant ramparts, horns blown in frantic alarm. But those warnings would mean little when the hush arrived at their gates. Winter needed no herald but the hush itself, unrelenting and absolute, drowning every cry in silent finality. They passed into a region of rolling hills that glistened under a thin veil of ice. The sky above threatened new snow. Heavy clouds pregnant with white fury. The hush pressed them on, neither hurried nor slow. Everything about their movement spoke of inevitability, as if the very ground yielded to them. At intervals, the wind carried distant sounds, scrapes of falling stones, the echo of crows, but the hush devoured each. The legion left nothing behind except footprints that the storms soon erased. Through every hour of that bleak pilgrimage, Viserys marched, the hush invading his every fiber. He no longer recalled the sting of molten gold, or the sting of his pride. He did not remember that once he had wanted to rule the Seven Kingdoms. No illusions of grandeur warmed him. Now he served a king older and colder than any mortal throne, his every step an ode to oblivion. The hush was all-encompassing, deeper than the blackest night. Ahead the Night King slowed, gazing upon a wide valley rimmed by jagged cliffs. A faint, ghostly shimmer lit the horizon, the vestige of a polar aurora dancing behind thick clouds. In that eerie glow, the hush took on an almost reverent quality, as though it too sensed the magnitude of this place. The whites clustered at the valley's edge, forming a silent army of hollow-eyed watchers. Viserys stood near the front, waiting. The hush held them there, suspended on the brink of the next assault, the next conquest. Above, the sky churned in swirling drifts, thick snow on the verge of release. One flake fell, then another, slowly at first, but increasing in volume. A soft hail of icy crystals that soon blossomed into a full blizzard. The hush devoured the howling wind, rendering it into a muted moan. Snow caked the undead, painting them white, merging them with the surroundings until they resembled statues carved from the same winter that birthed them. The Night King lifted his head to the storm, pale eyes reflecting the swirling flakes. In that hush, it was as though all creation held its breath. The valley awaited them, a stretch of white emptiness leading to who knew what distant fortress or settlement. The blizzard masked any outlines. The hush urged them forward, and they complied. Together, they stepped into the tumult of blowing snow. Their figures vanished one by one, fading into the storm as though swallowed by the swirling night. Yet the hush advanced, unstoppable, forging across the unseen valley. The world might shudder, but it could not halt what was coming. Each wight pressed on, guided by ancient power, footprints filling in behind them as quickly as they were made. Viserys moved with them, his once platinum hair matted to his scalp, lifeless eyes scanning the white void. The hush demanded no explanation, no reflection, only progress. Somewhere ahead lay a new horizon, new realms to claim. The hush would stretch out over every corner of creation if left unchecked. In that future, no voices would remain to speak of old kings, or golden crowns, or houses once known for dragons. The hush would consume them all, forging a single kingdom of winter under the Night King's will. And at the forefront walked Viserys Targaryen, dead to the last shred of mortal identity, forever marching through the silent storm. The blizzard raged on, swallowing all sight. A swirling cage of white. The hush settled deeper, thick as the drifts piling around them, so absolute that not even the faintest echo of memory could rise. Viserys walked, step after step, into an endless expanse of oblivion. The legion spread out in spectral lines, lost to each other in the snow, yet bound by the hush that wove them into a single entity. The Night King was out there, a silent core of power in the storm, his presence as constant as the cold. So the story continued, and so it would go on, hour after hour, day after day, for as long as it took for the hush to eclipse every distant hearth, every living breath. No cry would remain unquenched, no heart would remain unbeaten. The hush, once awakened, could never be silenced by mortal hands. It pressed forward, unstoppable, a tide of white that flattened kingdoms and devoured hope. Viserys, the puppet prince of ice, would walk this path forever, an echo of a dream drowned in snow. The storm raged, and the hush moved within it, a single unstoppable will, carrying winter's final breath across the land, deeper and deeper into the realms beyond. And even if the clouds parted to reveal a sun or a sky of jeweled constellations, the hush would remain, an eternal night that had found its champion in the silent king and his legion of the fallen. And among those fallen, one lost Targaryen trudged on, never again to feel the warmth of fire or the spark of ambition, only the unending hush of ice.